Welcome to Mr. Nightbleed. Tonight, in 7 disturbing things cemetery workers have witnessed, we descend into the silent world of the graveyard night shift. A place where names fade, candles flicker out on their own, and footsteps echo across gravel paths when you know you're utterly alone. These are chilling first-hand accounts from those who tend to the dead. Stories of bells that toll without wind, whispers leaking from cracked mausoleums, and graves that seem to breathe when no one's watching. This is a new channel, and my goal this month is to reach 3,000 subscribers. Almost 90% of viewers watch and leave without subscribing. Don't be one of them. Subscribe now. Before we begin, share in the comments where you're watching from and what hour of the night it is for you. And if there's a cemetery in your town that unsettles you, type its name. Because once you step past the gates of these haunted resting grounds, not everything allows you to leave. Kill the lights. Silence the world. Take a slow breath. And let us begin. I don't really care if anyone believes me, but I need to put this somewhere before it eats the rest of my sleep. I was the night watchman at a cemetery on a hill in a North London suburb. It isn't the famous one with the catacombs and the guided tours. Ours was the quieter cousin a couple of streets off Archway Road. Victorian stone angels with broken noses, yew trees like umbrellas that never fold, and a sloped path that pinches your calves on the way up. People forget it's there until they need it. I took the job last winter because night suited me and because my sister Leah said the quiet would be good for my head. She's a nurse who knows how to say things like that without making it sound like a diagnosis. The first week my shift ran from 6 in the evening to 6 in the morning. I'd unlock the gatehouse, log in, test the radio, make rounds with a torch heavy enough to double as a club. There's a routine you pick up quickly. Check the perimeter fence near the ivy mews, latch the tool shed, rattle the padlock on the old crypt that kids sometimes try for dares, point your torch into the dark gaps under the laurels where foxes like to make those human-sounding screams. You learn the cemetery's noises until they're like your flat's pipes, something you stop hearing unless it stops. A wind that always seems to come from the west, the hush of the A1 like a far sea, the rattle of trains if you listen hard and the night has room for it. On my third shift, the fog came in around 9. It was ordinary at first, the kind you taste, cold and tinny. The lamps along the main path were sodium yellow and made the fog look like watered-down tea. I didn't think anything of it until I reached the top of the hill by the War Memorial and realized I couldn't see the city lights beyond the fence. Usually the sky over Central is pink even at midnight, a muddle of light pollution. That night, the world past the railings had gone blank. I raised my torch and the beam hit the white wall and came back to me. It wasn't like the fog I knew. It had edges. Marcia, my supervisor, buzzed me on the radio to ask if I remembered to sign the delivery receipt for the new batteries. I said I did. She told me she'd be in tomorrow with the vicar to talk about the churchyard steps icing over. We chatted a minute about the Arsenal score. All perfectly normal. The fog thickened around my boots like someone unspooled cotton. I did another loop and told myself it would lift by midnight. The fog didn't lift. It stayed there all night, clinging to the iron railings and making halos around the lamps. I went home at 6 to my small flat above the off-license, tried to sleep, dreamed of walking into a white room and never finding the door. When I came back that evening, the fog was waiting for me on the grounds like the day had never warmed anything. Off the hill there was sun. On the hill there was the same damp air with a faint smell of pennies. I mentioned it to Colin, the daykeeper. Colin's the sort of man who never takes his scarf off even in July. He's worked the grounds since the council ran it and then when the trust took over. He has key rings jangling from both hips like a jailer. He scratched his beard and said winter fog does that sometimes, especially where there are yews. He told me to mind the steps and to bring the flowers at the gatehouse in each morning, before the foxes made off with them. Foxes love carnations, he said, which sounded like a joke until I saw a fox trotting past the stone cherubs with a magenta puff in its mouth. On the 6th night, Leah came up to my flat for tea before my shift. She noticed the damp smell on my jacket and told me I was going to mold if I kept coming home in clothes that wet. She's older by 3 years and can make a sentence sound like a hug and a telling off. I told her about the fog all over the cemetery and nowhere else, and she said, "Temperature inversions happen. And then, don't let it crawl under your skin. Nights will do that if you let them." She left me a Tupperware of soup and I promised to sleep more than 5 hours, which I didn't. At night, you start to count things because numbers reduce thinking. Steps between the gatehouse and the War Memorial, 148. Steps from the memorial to the east slope, 53 if you cut across, 67 if you stick to the path. 8 lamps along the main path, 2 that flicker sometimes, both with bulbs we've replaced twice. And then there were the footsteps. I heard them for the first time that Friday, around 2:30 in the morning. I'd locked the gates at 9, walked the perimeter twice, checked every latch and chain. At 2:30, something walked from the far gate along the gravel path, with the slow, controlled pace of someone who knows where each stone is. I stood in the fog and listened. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It reached the old lich gate, paused, then continued past the row of tall stones to the War Memorial. I raised my torch and shouted, "Hello? Grounds are closed." The beam hit fog, and the fog gave me back my voice in a softened way, as if I were underwater. I did what I was supposed to do. I called it in on the radio. Silence. I walked toward the sound, and the sound went on ahead, not speeding up to run from me, not slowing. Like a metronome set to a walking tempo, I got to the War Memorial and the footsteps went past. Down the slope toward the oldest stones where the names have worn down to shallow, hard-to-read cursive. There was a moment when I thought I saw something move the fog. A darker swathe, a man's height. But it might have been my beam jittering. I told myself it was a fox or a deer. There are deer sometimes. I went back to the gatehouse, watched the CCTV screens for motion. We have 4 cameras, 1 at each gate, 1 on the storage shed, 1 that looks down the main path. You've probably guessed what I saw. Nothing. Just grainy fog and halos of lamplight like suns behind thin clouds. I told myself we need better cameras. I wrote fog persistent in the logbook and underlined it twice. The flowers began to change after that. Along the path, people leave things, bouquets and paper cones from the Tesco on the corner, roses from the fancy florist that does weddings, small knitted tributes for children you're supposed to call angels, because there isn't a word that covers the hurt. We bring the flowers in each morning if they look like they'll be nicked, and we compost the ones that go to mush. On Monday, I unlocked the gatehouse and saw that all the bouquets left at the gate were gone. For a second, I thought foxes or kids. Then I walked up to the War Memorial and found them there. Every bloom stripped of ribbon and paper, laid in careful circles. Concentric rings that grew larger as they spread out from the base of the stone cross. Red, white, pink, yellow, then red again. No stems crossing, no mess. I stood there with my breath making its own fog and felt like someone had held my face in cold hands. Colin was angry about it in a practical way. "Disrespect," he said, "and if I catch the little sods." He fetched a broom and we swept the petals into a bin. Later, I couldn't remember the sound the broom made. It should have been a brushy scrape. In my head, it's the sound of shoes on gravel. Crunch, crunch. The next night, the footsteps came again right when I started to nod off in the gatehouse chair. The kind of drowsiness where your chin hits your chest and your whole body says, "Go home." I sat upright hard enough that my neck cracked, grabbed the torch, and went out. The fog swallowed me at the gatehouse threshold. I called, "And hello?" Because you have to do the thing even when you know it won't do anything. The steps went on ahead of me, turning the corner, not hurrying. I thought of the circles at the memorial, of how precise they were. Whoever did that would need time and patience and hands that knew how to make order where there wasn't any. I followed the sound. I counted my steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. The steps ahead of me didn't match mine. They were always, "This is important," just far. Enough that my torch couldn't punch through. And show me a back or a heel or missed, moving around a knee. I brought in help because I didn't want to be the only witness to my own crazy. Tom, a mate from school, does night shifts at a storage facility and loves proving a point. He came in on his night off with coffee and a thermos and a stupid grin. "Ghosts of North London," he said. "Popcorn optional." I made him promise to keep his voice down and gave him a high-vis vest from the peg, as if that might confer some authority. He made it halfway between joking and taking it serious, which is a hard balance to hold at 2 in the morning under fog that smells like coins. We sat in the gatehouse watching the monitors. We talked about nothing. We watched a fox streak between stones like a thought trying to get out before it loses itself. Around 2:20, he said, "I get what you mean about the fog. It's contained, like a room with no walls." At 2:33, the footsteps started. We both heard them at the same time. He lifted a finger like a conductor and said, "Too loud, there we go." I shushed him and we went out. We tried to be smart about it. He went left at the main path and I went right. The steps tracked ahead of us both, equally distant, like it was a sound pinned to a horizon that moved when we moved. Tom, who had been cocky 10 minutes before, stopped with his hands on his hips and said into the fog, "All right, mate, enough." The steps kept on, turned the corner where the tall angels are, headed toward the east slope where the ground holds moisture, and the earth collapses a bit over the older graves. We converged there, both of us breathing like we'd run, even though we hadn't. It was quiet. Quiet in the way that makes you notice your tongue touching your teeth. "Okay," Tom said finally. "Okay, I heard it. That's weird." We were both so happy to have the other's ears that we didn't notice the flowers until we were nearly treading on them. There they were again, circles, 5 of them, laid on the path halfway down the slope. Not grand, not dramatic. Quiet circles, neat as diagrams, made of what had been at the gatehouse a few hours earlier. Tom squatted and touched a petal. It left a smear of damp on his fingertip. "Who's doing this?" he said, meaning which living human. We both turned our heads at the same time toward the fog, and the fog didn't give us anyone. The satisfaction of being believed faded. There's a step past being scared by yourself, being scared politely, with someone else's worse. We called the police because that's what you do in London when you can't put a name to something. Constable Patel came up in a van with the orange light flicking through the fog like a slow lighthouse. He's small and careful, and knows half the people in the neighborhood. He treated us like we weren't mad. He asked if we had angry relatives or bored teenagers. He walked the path with us, wrote notes, took a photo of the circles. The flash made them harsh. He said he'd swing by over the week. He did once around 1 in the morning, stood with me under the porch of the gatehouse and listened until the fog damped our warm breath into nothing. That night, of course, the footsteps didn't come. The next night, when it was just me, they did. By the second week of circles, the vicar came by during the day with Marcia. He's called Father Bernard, and he has the permanent drowned look of a man who's worn a damp scarf for 40 years. He asked if anyone had been buried in the wrong plot recently, as if a misfiled paper could itch its way up through dirt and order petals. He stood with his hands threaded at the fingers and made a small prayer that sounded like an apology for the weather. Marcia brought me a new pair of gloves and told me not to engage with anything at night, which is the kind of instruction you get when the person giving it doesn't sit alone in a gatehouse at 3 in the morning. There were practical things. We set up a motion sensor tied to a buzzer in the gatehouse. It buzzed twice one night when nothing moved on the screens. We chalked arrows on the stones pointing to the nearest exits, a trick from a park ranger video. The arrows smeared as if wiped by damp sleeves. We ran a string line from the gatehouse down the main path and clipped it at intervals in case the fog got too dense, and we needed to find our way back by feel. At 3:10 one morning, I followed the string and my fingers slid along damp nylon until there was nothing there but cold air, as if the line had been cut, except it hadn't, because when I turned around and walked 3 steps the other way, my fingers found it again exactly where it should be. I told myself I'd misjudged the distance. I told myself I'd turned around twice. Colin, who had insisted at first that fog was fog, stopped arguing and started leaving me extra tea in the break room. On Thursday, he told me he used to hear a whistle on the east slope, always the same tune, and he'd never said because you don't share the thing that makes you uneasy with the person who stays at night. He said the whistle stopped after the council redid the drainage in Stro 9. It felt like a story you tell to be kind, but he meant it. He avoids the war memorial now as if the circles might indict him. Leah kept asking if I should change shifts. I kept saying it's just weather and some idiot with nothing better to do. I didn't say how the fog seemed to wait for me for the minute between when I locked the gates and when I shut the gatehouse door, as if it wanted to come in and sit with me. I didn't say how. At home, my windows would steam on the inside even when the radiators were off. I didn't say how I'd started hearing the slow steps in other places, a supermarket aisle late, the corridor at the storage unit when I helped Tom move boxes, a hospital ward when I went to bring Leah her lunch, peripheral sounds that settled and wouldn't quite go. The closest I came to quitting was the night the radio spoke. We're supposed to check in with the private security company once an hour. Mostly it's dead air and then a bored voice and me saying, "All quiet." At 2:40, the footsteps started, patient as ever. I held the radio and pressed the button to say, "Possible trespasser on the grounds." I heard my own voice and then under it, as if the fog had gotten into the circuit, A second voice that said my name. Not a hiss, not a misheard word. My name the way Leah says it when she's calling me to wake up. I froze the way a rabbit freezes in a garden when it knows a fox is nearby but doesn't know where. I waited for anything else, nothing. Say again? The bored voice said a moment later. I put the radio down on the desk and watched it as if it were an animal that might bite. I brought in Anya, the florist from down the road, because she does the arrangements for the nicer funerals and knows flowers like people know dogs. I asked her to show me how someone would lay circles that clean in the dark. She said they'd need light even with night vision eyes. She said they'd need patience and dry hands. She said the circles looked like crop circles, which made me laugh in the gatehouse in a way that didn't sound like me. She brought me a posy and told me not to let foxes outwit me. That night the footsteps walked past me when I was standing in the main path. There's no other way to say it. The sound arrived and then continued on the far side. I felt not a wind exactly, just a brief awareness of space moving around me, like when a lift rises and your stomach takes a second to catch up. After you've been frightened by something that refuses to show you a face, you do silly human things to test what rules it lives by. I left a ring of salt by the gatehouse door. In the morning, the ring was smudged and there were petals pressed into it. I tied a cowbell to the string line, because the sound of a bell is supposed to mean something you can decide later. The bell chimed once at 3:03 and once at 3:17 without any wind that I could feel. I wrote times in the log. The log's pages grew thin and damp. When I flipped to the back to start a new one, lines had bled through like bruises. I tried to catch a person at it, of course. I texted Tom to come again, and he did. And he was brave in the way you're brave in a flat room. He stood in the fog with his hands on his hips and declared we were being had. The footsteps came and he swore at them, and then he stopped swearing because a voice swearing in fog seems to fall straight down. We did a stupid experiment with my phone's voice memo, holding it out at arm's length, letting it run, then playing it back in the gatehouse under the buzzing strip light while our tea went cold. We got 30 minutes of damp air. Then, at minute 21, an extra crunch, distinct and near. We looked at each other at the same time. Two men sitting in a small square of dry, listening to the sound of a shoe that never touched anything. "Delete it," Tom said. "Don't. I didn't delete it." I also didn't listen to it again. The last night I worked alone was a Friday. The fog was thicker and yet somehow brighter, the way white things look too white when there's nothing to compare them to. I had that feeling of time stacking rather than passing. The flowers had been light that week, 2 funerals. One for a man named Albert, whose daughter cried quietly without dabbing her eyes. One for a woman named Maureen who'd outlived everyone who'd have cried for her. I put the gatehouse bouquets inside like always and told myself that if there were circles in the morning, it was because I'd missed something. At 2:28, the footsteps started, earlier than usual. Right away, I felt foolish for knowing that. I went out with the torch and stopped at the threshold, where the dry stopped and the damp began. I didn't call out. I let the sound go past and followed. It turned not left this time, not right, but cut across the grass where we ask people not to go. Out of respect, I followed without stepping on headstones because I have habits. The sound went to the war memorial. It stopped. I raised the torch and my beam found the circles before my eyes did. 7 rings this time, tight as targets, centered on the base of the cross. The smallest was no bigger than a plate. They were made from everything that had come through the gate that week. Carnations, lilies, a spray of gypsophila, 2 stems of blue hydrangea, a cluster of white chrysanthemums. The hydrangea was my undoing. I'd taken the paper off that one myself because it had stuck. Whoever did this had been careful not to bruise them. The radio crackled. I let my hand drift toward it and stopped. I had that sense you get when you know someone's behind you and you also know it isn't your someone. I didn't turn around. I stood there and let my breath set its own pace. The fog didn't move. I said, because the human body will do anything to make the world feel shared. "What do you want?" The fog held its shape. The footsteps started again behind me and to the left, as if whoever it was stepping into position, as if the circles weren't decoration but a diagram. The steps stopped at the smallest circle, the one nearest the base. I wanted a lot of things. I wanted Leah to knock on the gatehouse door and tell me to stop being daft and to come home and eat. I wanted a drunk teenager to stumble out of the fog and giggle and say, "We got you." I wanted a fox to yip so I could call it a fox. I didn't get any of those. I got the bell I'd hung on the string line chiming somewhere behind me. I got the radio making a soft exhale that sounded like someone trying not to cry. I got the smell of flowers and iron growing stronger, as if the fog had warmed by a degree and could release something it had been holding. "Please," I said. The word left my mouth and hung in the air like steam. The footsteps didn't move toward me. They didn't move away. They took one step right, then left, then right again, as if measuring a distance. I had the sense, not of being in danger exactly, but of being weighed. I crouched slowly, the way you do when there's a stray cat under a car and you don't want to spook it. I reached out 2 fingers and touched the hydrangea head on the smallest circle. It was cold, not soaked. I thought stupidly of Anya, of how she said hands had to be dry. Mine were not. My fingers left a darker patch. When I pulled them back, the patch stayed. The footsteps took one more crunch. I closed my eyes because my body decided it couldn't understand this with its eyes open. Nothing happened for a long time. It might have been 15 seconds. It might have been an hour. My eyes watered from not blinking. When I opened them, the circles were still there and I was alone in my breath. I stood up, which felt like the bravest thing I've ever done. I backed up 3 steps and then turned and walked to the gatehouse and shut the door and sat in the chair. My hands shook so badly I knocked my tea onto the logbook. I listened for the bell. It didn't ring again. In the morning, the circles were gone. There were petals in the bin I hadn't put there. There was damp on the floor that dried in shoe-shaped patches that didn't match any shoes I own. I didn't say anything to Colin. He came in later than usual and rubbed at his wrists and told me his boiler had gone. Like the whole neighborhood was a degree colder than it should be. I told Marcia I wanted days for a bit. She didn't ask why. She doesn't have to. People last on nights until they don't. Father Bernard patted my shoulder and called it seasonal. Tom said, "I heard it too, you know," and then didn't make me talk about it. Leah brought me a sandwich and looked at me in the way she did when we were kids and I came home with my knuckles skinned. "You don't have to be the one who fixes it," she said. I said I knew. I don't think I do. If you want something as neat as those circles to finish this, I don't have it. On my last night before days, I walked the grounds once at dusk. The fog was thin then, almost a memory of fog. It's worse late. In the softer light, the stones looked less judgmental. There's a grave under the U with my family name on it, though not anyone I know. I stopped and read the dates and did the bad math of time. A fox went by, dim as a rumor. I stood by the war memorial longer than I needed to, and tried to tell the air I was leaving, which is sentimental and pointless. The air didn't change. The lamps buzzed. Some nights are just nights, even when some aren't. At home, I slept harder than I had in weeks. When I woke, there was damp on the inside of my bedroom window. A circle where someone had wiped it clear. The way you wipe a porthole to look out. In the circle, my street looked soft and ordinary. A woman with a buggy. A courier with a parcel. My heartbeat stepped along like shoes on gravel. I stood there with my hand not touching the glass. Leah texted a photo of a cat in a Halloween costume and asked if I wanted to meet for coffee on Holloway Road. I said yes. It was raining. The kind of rain that makes the city smell like stone. The day after that, I had to pop back up to the cemetery on an errand for Marcia. Paperwork that wouldn't print in the office. I told myself I'd only be 5 minutes, that I'd go in daylight. I walked up the hill with the umbrella banging my shoulder, thinking I'd done the right thing. The fog wasn't there on the street. It waited, like always, where the railings began. Not heavy, not a wall, just a suggestion. Enough that sound felt old. Colin waved from under the porch. I nodded and went into the gatehouse and picked up the sheaf of papers. I stood for a second and listened. It was quiet. Then, maybe because I was listening or because silence makes room, I heard the light shuffle of flowers being set down on stone. Not close, not far. The sort of distance a person keeps if they know your name but aren't sure which way to say it. I locked the gatehouse door and told myself I'd imagined it, and that imagining is what minds do when you let them. On the way down, just before the railings ended and the normal air began, I stepped on something soft. A petal, hydrangea blue, gone translucent in the rain. I don't keep it. I didn't bring it home to press in a book. I kicked it off my shoe and watched it stick to the path in the shape of a circle, missing all its other parts. Then I walked into the part of London that isn't fog and looked back once, which I try not to do. The hill looked the same as it always has, which is to say, you could miss it if you wanted. Sometimes late. If the hall in my building is quiet and the upstairs neighbor isn't on his treadmill, I hear the slow approach of someone coming down the carpeted stairs, one thoughtful step at a time. It will stop outside my door or above it or go on past, it depends on the night. I don't open the door. I stand there and hold my breath and listen to the silence that comes back. Then I sleep or I don't. I've stopped trying to decide which is the better choice. The flowers on the hill will be where someone needs them. The circles, if they happen, won't be for me. That's the thing I tell myself. Some nights it holds, some nights it doesn't. And some mornings when I walk to the bus, the damp on the pavement looks from a distance like rings. If I squint, I can pretend it's just rain doing what rain does, finding a shape when it has nothing else to cling to. If I don't squint, I see the circles anyway. I keep walking. I don't look back more than once. I don't always count the steps. I don't usually post things online, but I've hit the point where silence feels like I'm helping the wrong side. If you think I'm making this up, that's fine. I restore stone for a living. Marble, pietra serena, terracotta. If it's been rained on for 100 years, I've probably scraped it, poulticed it, or coaxed a stain out of its pores. I'm not dramatic. I'm the kind of person who folds tarps the same way every time and labels brushes with masking tape. But there's something I cleaned in Florence that started cleaning me back, and I can't pretend it was condensation or a bad seal in the pipes anymore. It cried, it still cries, and the tears taste like the sea. I was hired on a short contract at a small parish south of the river, the kind tourists forget after they've taken pictures of the Duomo. It's on a narrow street where the delivery vans scrape the plaster, and the baker across the alley throws leftover bread to the pigeons at dawn. Inside the church, the nave is cool, dim, and damp like a breathing cellar. The sacristy smells like old beeswax. The crypt where I spent most of my time smells like limestone and cold coins. The priest, Father Aldo, joked that it was the well of air. He kept a ring of keys that would jangle before you saw him. He knew every draft in that place. He said, "Don't fear the air. Fear the people who forgot to close doors." I wasn't working alone. There was my friend Dario, a night guard with a tired knee and an even more tired laugh. He watched the security monitors during fledgling tourist season and shooed away kids who tried to carve initials in the pews. There was also my sister Elisa, who was finishing her conservation program. She came twice a week to practice gentle miracles and correct my temper when I got impatient with poultices that needed a whole day to draw out a stain. We used to make fun of the restoration jargon. "We are applying a Japanese paper interface," she'd say, and I'd answer, "We are apologizing to the marble with damp tissue." Our main project was a group of marble angels in the crypt, part of an old memorial cycle, 18th century, my guess, though the dates were muddled. They had the kind of faces you stop calling pretty and start calling careful. One rested her cheek on the back of her hand and looked like she was listening to a quiet person. Another held a torch pointed down. The one I'm talking about leaned slightly forward with her head turned, like someone had just called her name and she hadn't decided whether to answer. Her eyes were carved with shallow finesse that makes a face change when light moves across it. In the morning, she looked serious. In the late afternoon, if a car in the street threw a stray beam down the stairs, she looked as if she was about to say, "Wait." We noticed the first wetness on a Monday, when Elisa was testing solvent on an old candle soot smear. She paused, frowned, and dabbed 2 fingers along the angel's cheek. "You put too much water in the slurry," she said absent-mindedly, and then she tasted her fingertips, realized what she'd done, and laughed. "Oh, don't ever do that." "Why did I do that?" She grabbed a cloth.
Is this salty?"
She dabbed again, more carefully, and leaned close. "This is not our water." "Efflorescence," I said, like a man trying to name a noise in the dark to keep it from being a ghost. "The crypt is cool and damp. Salts migrate to the surface after a rain. We see white bloom all the time on brick. Except this wasn't white. It was clear. A bead, then a thin run like a streak of breath frozen and slid down the face. There was no white crust at the edges. It was a clean tear track you could only see when it caught the light. I wiped it gently with a dry lint-free cloth and pressed my hand to the marble. Cold. Of course. Stone never rushes to meet you. We made a note. The day's log for the angel. Minor moisture on right cheek removed, monitor. We monitor everything. We weigh poultices after use to estimate what they pulled up. We weigh our own coffee cups too, if you let us. It didn't register as ominous. Not then. That night after the church had closed and the last tourist had backed out apologizing for stepping over a rope, I stayed late to rewrap a scaffolding joint. Dario propped the crypt door with his foot while he scrolled through messages. "You're married to that angel now?" he asked. "She's leaking," I said. "We'll get divorced when I find the source," he smirked. He had a way of making even an eyebrow look lazy. "I didn't think angels married. They're worse than people," I said. "They pretend they don't, but they want everything their way." He laughed and left me with the air. When you're alone underground in a place built to house the dead and store holy oil, every sound turns into a personality. The fluorescent ballast hums like a held breath. Pipes sing low from somewhere you can't see. Footsteps 2 rooms away can be a truck outside or God, and you have to pretend you believe both possibilities make equal sense. I worked, listening for the church to tell me I'd done enough. Somewhere above me, the baker charlied a metal tray with a bang. Somewhere behind me, a single drop of water clicked. I wiped my hands, turned off the lights, and locked up. The next morning, the tear was back. Same place, a little lower. I dabbed it, sniffed it out of habit, hated myself, and then did what I promised myself I wouldn't. I touched my tongue to the cloth. I wouldn't write this if it didn't matter. Stone doesn't cry brine. Rainwater doesn't. Groundwater in that area is hard and metallic. This was slight human salt. Elisa watched me and said, "Bravo, we're licking angels now." I don't want to talk about it. "Let's do a strip test," she said, serious now. She cut a strip of pH paper, but that just gave us neutral. She wrote to her professor and asked for advice on mapping invisible moisture migration. He suggested chalk lines and patience. We dusted soft chalk across the angel's face very lightly. The way you exhale a promise while you make it. If moisture forms, chalk darkens. If it spreads, it leaves a map. I marked the time on the log. 10:20 at 12:05, while a tourist group upstairs murmured about frescoes, we checked the chalk. A faint path from the inner corner of the eye to the cheek had turned slightly darker, a thread no thicker than a hair. A tear's path, a perfect gravitational obedience, no moisture anywhere else. I checked the ceiling, dry. I checked the wall behind, dry. I checked for a hairline crack at her lid, nothing. The tear wasn't seeping out of a flaw. It was appearing on the surface. We tried to be rational. You survive old buildings by assuming the building is always smarter than you. If a draft exists, it exists for a reason. If a damp patch blooms, it tells you where you misread something. I checked the gutter drainage around the foundation. The downspouts were clear. A dry spell had kept the stone cool but not wet. We started measuring humidity in the crypt. It hovered between 67 and 74% most mornings. The angel cried every day. A week later, a woman from the neighborhood, Signora Conti, stopped 2 steps inside the crypt and crossed herself. She always brought flowers for a memorial niche, rolled her eyes at tourists, and told me exactly what I was doing wrong. "You can't squeeze a saint like that," she said when I tightened a clamp. "She's not a sausage." That morning she paused by the angel and put a finger near the cheek without touching it. Always the same. "They think I don't see." She shook her head and went to her flowers. "What do you mean?" I called up to her. "Every summer now," she said. "It started after they walled up the little bones." She didn't like to speak loud in the crypt. The air eats sound in there. She hurried away, no explanation, like she had smuggled a secret in her grocery bag and was worried it would be taken. When I asked Father Aldo later, he was distracted by a phone call and a leaky sacristy sink. "Conti will turn anything into a story," he said. The ossuary was reorganized. Past centuries mixed a lot of things, and it isn't respectful to leave them as they were. He gave me a look that meant, "Do your job," and he'd take care of the rest. Priests make that face when they're protecting people from too much information, or from the kind of answer that breaks little Sunday routines. Dario called the crying our mascara run. Every night on the monitor, he would zoom in on the angel's face and say in a movie trailer voice, "She cries for you, Luca." I told him to get a hobby. He said I was his hobby. Then one night he didn't say anything. He played the previous hour's footage in silence, brow folded. The security camera for the crypt is an old one. Its image looks like a fishbowl, and when it cycles night mode, it goes into that haunted gray you see in cheap documentaries. He scrubbed back and forth and then froze the frame. The angel. The light had stayed constant. Nobody had gone down there. Between 02:11 and 02:13, a darker ribbon appeared on the angel's face. Not from above, not from the side. It materialized like breath on glass. Dario reversed the footage in slow motion. It didn't bloom outward like a damp patch. It drew itself as if a finger were invisible and dragging water down the cheek. "Elisa," I said, and texted her the file. She came the next morning with eyes like someone had pushed sleep off the bed to make room for a problem. She set up her own small camera at the foot of the statue, because conservators are less likely than guards to accept haunted fishbowl images. "If it happens, we'll have better contrast," she said. She also brought little sterile vials. "If you insist on tasting it like a superstitious fisherman, at least let me run the sample at the lab. Salinity, trace ions. I'll call in a favor. The crying didn't happen while she was there. Of course it didn't. It happened at 02:33 when the lights were off and the crypt was a blind throat." Dario texted me and I didn't sleep. The next morning we collected 3 samples with gloved hands, like the angel had a fever and we were taking blood. Elisa went to the lab. I went to the downspouts again and the gutters again and tapped plaster in the adjoining wall until my knuckles tingled. While I tapped, a boy's voice came from the stairs. "Are angels thirsty?" It was the baker's grandson. He had snuck in with his grandmother before school once and had decided I belonged to him. He asked questions without any shame. "Do they like paper or real flowers? Do they cry when you tell them to stop?" "We don't tell angels what to do," I said, smiling because he was the only person who made the crypt feel less like the inside of someone's mouth. "We ask them nicely." "What do you ask her?" "I ask her who she's listening to. Who is it?" He cupped his hand to his ear theatrically and leaned toward the statue's mouth. Then he took his hand away and blinked. "She said she hears the names." "What names?" He looked straight at me like I'd been tricked. "You're the one who's supposed to know." The lab came back with numbers. Lisa showed me the email on her phone while we sat on the step outside, where the street cats sunned themselves on the stones. "Salinity comparable to human tears," she said, reading. "Sodium chloride presented concentration consistent with lacrimal fluid. Calcium and potassium trace. No significant nitrates. Phosphate trace is weird. The rest is what you'd get if you cried on something and then caught it in a jar." She looked at me over the top of the screen. "Luca, I sent him a dummy sample too. Distilled water I rubbed on my own arm to see if we were picking up something from handling. He caught that difference. This isn't a lab glitch. I didn't label this magic." She laughed, but it sounded like someone playing an old record too slow. "Salt migrates," I said. It was automatic to say. It's true. White bloom pulls through masonry, but salt doesn't assemble itself into human tears on command. That night Dario called me at home. His voice was tight. "Come, if you can. Now." By the time I arrived, he had a chair pitched backwards on 2 legs and his good foot planted against the console as if he were pushing the building away. He didn't look away from the monitor. "Listen," he whispered, and it was so unlike him that I actually listened. The crypt camera showed the familiar frame of the angel, gray and grainy. There was no one there. The lights in the crypt were out. From the speakers came a sound I'd heard 1,000 times in 1,000 places. Air moving through a pipe. A drain clearing slowly, the sort of sob ordinary plumbing makes when pressure equalizes. Only it wasn't the plumbing. I know the plumbing in that place. The pitch was wrong. It caught and released like someone trying not to let sound out of their throat. Just once, very soft, it hit that flutter you hear from a person who's been holding it back for a long time and makes a little animal noise despite themselves. I felt on the back of my neck the ghost of my mother's hand, the way she would touch my hair without making contact. Dario swallowed hard. The sound went on for about 7 seconds. When it stopped, the speakers kept breathing like a person had calmed down just enough to be embarrassed. He scrubbed back. He scrubbed forward. The timestamp said 0302. "It's there 3 nights out of 4 now," he said. "The other nights it's quieter." "Father Aldo will love this," I said. My mouth was dry. We played it for him in the morning. He watched the screen without flinching and then said, "The microphones pick up pipes. We can't upset the families." He meant funeral families. In the last month, the parish had handled 3. Nothing unusual. He took a slow breath. "Luca, don't tell the neighborhood a statue is crying." "I'm telling you a statue is crying," I said, too sharp. He looked at me. The glance was not angry. It was pleading. "Keep caring for her," he said. "If she needs drying, dry her. If she needs silence, give her that." We gave her both. We stopped joking. We tried everything that wasn't violence. We turned the dehumidifier down and took it away because it made the air taste like plastic. We stopped the mechanical fans because airflow on stone can make moisture do tricks. We checked rainfall data. We checked the Arno's level. We laid tissue pickups at the angel's cheek and weighed them before and after without telling each other the numbers, so we wouldn't cheat. The night she cried the most, my pickup increased by 0.6 grams. When you work with stone, that's a heavy grief to hold in your hand. The event that changed our caution into fear came a few days after the parish finished bricking up a little arched recess in the crypt wall. It had been an old ossuary access, a place where generations ago bones were stored and moved. It wasn't sacrilege. It was logistics. Bones unsettle tourists. The arch had been boarded for years and then properly sealed with stones after the city did a dampness survey. New mortar, neat joints. The masons did a beautiful job. If you didn't know it had been an opening, you'd think it was always a patch. The night they set the last stone, Dario noted an anomaly on his sheet. The sobbing started at 02:11. It continued for a full minute. Not steady. It swelled and caught again, as if something behind a wall were taking air in short, exhausted sips. He didn't call me. He went downstairs with the emergency light. The dehumidifier was off. The crypt was black. He pushed the door open and stood at the top of the stairs because he'll joke about anything except stairs and darkness. You never know what kind of shadow believes it belongs there. There was a smell he couldn't place, like a room that hasn't been opened but is still full of breath. He lifted the light. The beam hit the angel. Her cheek was wet. Not a single trace. A chain of them. A necklace of tears. 5 or 6 drops in a descending path. One of them hanging so heavy at the corner of the mouth it made her look like she'd been trying to say something with liquid teeth. Dario said what I love about his honesty, and I'll repeat it. I wanted to go back upstairs and pretend I'd gone down. But I didn't. I stood there and said, "Okay, tell me what you want." He doesn't speak like that to people. He did it to stone. He waited. He told me the only other sound was a faint trickle, like water whispering. He swung the light toward the sound. It was coming from the newly bricked recess. Not from the joints or the stones, they were perfect. From the wall as a whole, the way a throat makes a sound you can't pin to a single chord. The light shook a little because his knee did, and then he took one step down and then another. The sound stopped the way you stop crying when someone enters the room. Too suddenly. The crypt made that disappointed silence that has weight. In the morning, a thin line of damp had bled out from 3 of the mortar joints and dried into a soft powder bloom. Nothing more. The angel's cheek was marked with salt flakes where the tears had sat long enough to evaporate. I brushed them away, and the sound that came out of me must have been quiet because Elisa didn't look over. It's the sound you make when you've just realized the thing you like doing might be listening to you like you're a radio. The boy from the bakery came back with his grandmother and left me a folded paper crane in the donation basket. "For when she is listening again," he said. His grandmother scolded him for putting paper where coins should go, then gave me a bag with 2 sugar-dusted pastries and told me I was too thin. Italians are consistent even when angels cry. We started keeping a list. We wrote down the nights she cried a lot and the days there were funerals and the names of the dead. I pretended the list would look like a coincidence when we were finished. It didn't. The nights the parish held vigils, the sobbing was softer, like it knew the voices upstairs were doing a different job. The morning after, the family of a man named Tommaso brought his football scarf and left it draped around a wooden cross. The angel's tear line was pronounced, and the first drop had fallen all the way to the collarbone and sat like a pearl in the shallow carve. Elise touched it on the edge with the corner of a tissue. The way you touch someone's face when you want them to know you're there, but you don't want to put fingerprints on their sadness. The paper came away heavy, when the neighborhood heard anyway, because neighborhoods always do. People began to come and stand far back and pretend they were just admiring the memorial cycle. The hairdresser down the street came on her lunch break and lingered with her hand in her pocket for so long. The bells had time to mark the hour and the half hour. 2 carabinieri stopped by, pretended they'd been sent, and left with their heads turned as if they didn't want to give the angel the satisfaction of their curiosity. I saw the way they breathed in as they passed the bricked recess. That breath you take when you've just smelled rain where there isn't any. Elisa kept asking for permission to probe behind the wall. If there is a micro leak in the line, it could be channeling cooling condensate. The pressure could carry trace salts if the line is upstream, she said, and I loved her for the way she needed the world to behave even when it won't. The parish said no. The city said no. The money said no. Stone cries look good on brochures, but drilling a hole in a crypt is expensive in a way you can't explain to donors who want their name on something that doesn't look like a wound. One afternoon, while Father Aldo was away and the sacristy was in chaos because the new volunteer kept switching candles with candles that were blessed for different days, I moved my ladder to clean dust from the angel's hair. I climbed 3 steps, then stopped. I had been okay with tears that came back every morning. I had not made peace with what new light did to her face. From this height, the angel's expression constructed itself differently. Her lips weren't parted. They weren't willing. They were pressed in an effort not to say the name she had heard. It's a sculptor's trick, sure, but no trick would have made my stomach go cold like that. I cleaned anyway because cleaning is an answer you can hold in your hands. That night, clouds built up above the city and the Arno smelled like it. Sometimes smells, metallic, then almost sweet and then not at all like water. I woke at 1:50, stared at the ceiling, and decided to go in. The street was empty except for the cat that hates me for no reason and hides behind the drain pipe. Dario had the monitors on a different camera. A guy upstairs had a backpack too full and looked like a thief, though he was probably just someone who thinks an empty church is a good hiding place. I went down to the crypt without turning on the lights. If you want to know what it's like to stand in a room carved out for grief in a country where the dead have more addresses than the living, stand there in the dark. The voices from upstairs felt like they were outside the skin of the building. The crypt air was denser. The sobbing started before I got to the bottom step. Not through the speakers. In the room. It started soft enough that I thought I had made a noise with my shoes. Then it steadied and I knew it wasn't me. It came from the bricked recess for a long, unbroken half-minute, like a person on the other side of stone had finally given up the idea that crying would make them weak. "Okay," I said, my voice stupid and human and suddenly too loud. "Okay, what do you want?" I felt dumb. I felt like I was asking a wall to please stop being itself. The sobbing cut off. The silence that followed was the kind that makes your teeth feel like glass. Then, very soft, from near my left shoulder at a height where a mouth would be if a friend leaned close, I heard a whisper. It wasn't words I could recognize. It was the sound of language without shape. A breath with edges, not male, not female, thick, like someone had been crying into fabric for a long time and had not had enough water. When it ended, something cold touched my cheek. You don't feel cold in a crypt as separate from the air. You live in it and it lives in your lungs. This cold had a border, like a coin, like a fingertip. I flinched. I was embarrassed by the way I grabbed the railing like a child. The emergency light in my hand threw itself against the marble. The angel's cheek shone, and in that weak light I saw the bead sitting exactly at the inside corner of the eye reform, as if my flinch had shaken it off and the statue hadn't accepted that. A fresh tear drew itself down, heavy, dragging more of itself as it went. It hung for a second on the lip of the mouth and fell. It hit stone and made a sound that would have been comical if it had been anything else. A tiny tick, absurd and undeniable. I wiped the cheek. I said, "I hear you," because I'd run out of smarter things. The whisper didn't return. The wall didn't weep again while I was there. After the tick, a new silence. One that had made a choice and ended. I stood there until my knees hurt. Then went upstairs and shook my hands like I'd been carrying. Something heavy I had to put down without waking. Someone in the next room. The next day we got permission to open a small inspection on the other side of the wall. Not in the crypt, but in a utility space beyond the sacristy where you can access old cables and the rear of the apse. We cut a neat little square in the plaster. Elisa didn't trust anyone else to do it, and we shone a light into the darkness. You've seen movie moments like that where a rat leaps out or the flashlight catches a face, but this is Florence, where even surprises are polite. It was empty space, old stone, dust, a bat of insulation someone had stuffed in years ago and forgotten. The stones of the bricked arch were perfect on their hidden faces, too. Near the bottom, wedged where a hand might have slipped it if a hand had access, there was a bundle. It was wrapped in fabric that had turned from blue to almost gray. Elastic that had been white had collapsed to threads. I reached in slowly and took it out while Elisa held the light like a halo. It was a collection of small metal plates about the size of cigarette packs, wrapped together. When I peeled the fabric away, the plates rattled delicately like teeth on a tray. They were memorial plaques, the kind you screw against a niche when you don't have a full stone or you can't afford one. They were old, not 18th century, not yesterday. Maybe wartime or just after. Some had names scratched crudely, Some had dates without years. A few had only initials and a cross. One had a line in shaky hand. For my mother who could not be with her sons. Another said, to those we could not name. There were 20, 30, maybe more, packed tight. They weren't the ossuary. They were the conversation of people who ran out of right ways to say things and threaded wrong ways together. We brought them to the sacristy table like relics. We were careful in the way you forget to be in your own kitchen sometimes. Father Aldo looked at them and took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. We had a bad winter in 67, he said, then corrected himself. 66. The flood. Afterward, everything left without order was brought back in boxes. Some things got lost even while they were being saved. Elisa reached and aligned 2 plaques so the edges met as if they had missed that for decades. We can catalog them, she said. We can return them to the wall. We did. Over the next week, we cleaned the plates gently, left the scratches, recorded the names we could, and set them up on a small stand near the angel without making a big show. The standing frame looked like a little school display about memory and embarrassment. People stopped and pretended they were looking for something else, then stood for a long time, and then left coins. The sobbing quieted. It didn't stop. It became less like an emergency and more like a person next door whose TV you can hear through the wall. Always at the same volume for so long you forget it's on until the day it goes off and the silence feels wrong. The tears did not stop. They changed. Where they fell, they dried in a way that left tiny halos if we weren't careful to lift them before they evaporated. I started to wipe the angel each night before closing. It felt like brushing someone's hair for bed. I would stand with a cloth and talk under my breath and tell her what my day had been like. My mother used to do that with our dog, and then with my father when he got sick. And then with the radio, when the radio was the only thing that would answer back without asking anything of her. The tears left salt on my fingers if I wasn't careful. The taste didn't surprise me anymore. It had the inevitability of morning traffic. One late afternoon, a teenager with a denim jacket and a jacket full of bravery walked right up to the angel and touched the cheek with his knuckle. I started to tell him not to. He leaned in and whispered, "Not to me. I can't even cry in my own room without my father making a face." He looked over his shoulder like he had done something criminal, and his eyes were wet in a way he probably wouldn't admit even to himself. He hurried out. The tear that night was heavier. It didn't make sense. They never do. They refuse to be leveled by reason. They add and then subtract something you didn't know you gave them. We reinstalled the plaques properly with the city's permission. It felt like putting teeth back in a mouth. The day we finished, the baker's grandson came and stood with us. He looked at the names, moved his lips silently over those he could read, and then looked at the angel. "Can she hear all of them at the same time?" he asked. "I think she hears the ones we don't," I said before I could stop the sentence from leaving me. At night in my apartment, the pipes started to sound like the crypt. It's probably that I'd trained my body to interpret certain pitches as a person on the other side of stone. The sink gurgled, and I sat up like I'd been tapped on the shoulder. A neighbor coughed, and I felt the shape of the angel's mouth in my head, the way the lower lip carried weight when wet. Elisa got offered a placement with a firm that restores big names, places tourists line up to see, places where a crying angel would be a marketing problem instead of a miracle or a nuisance. She took it. Of course she did. I told her I was proud, and I was. But I also felt like the person who watches a train leave and swallows the idea that maybe the train's organizer had meant to double book a seat. On her last day, she went down to the crypt alone for a while. When she came back, her eyes were a little red in a way that suggested dust, because conservators are good at giving even their own faces an excuse. Dario quit. His knee got worse, and another job paid €1 more to sit and watch a different set of ghosts blink on a different screen. He shook my hand, held it a second too long, and said, "Stop going down after midnight. Or don't, but if you don't, wear better shoes." He laughed. Then he didn't. "It's doing something to you." "I wipe it," I said. "That's all." "You listen," he said. "That's more dangerous." I got a contract at another church now, this one north of the center, where the tourists stop because they're tired of walking, and it has an easy square to sit in. The air there is drier. The stone there complains in a different language. The first day, I set my tools on the sacristy table and found salt on the handle of my favorite chisel. I had cleaned it the night before. I had put it in my bag. I stood there with the chisel in my hand and felt silly for feeling watched. Then the pipe in the corner coughed the way pipes do, and under that shape of sound there was a thinner one like a draft pulling a secret through a keyhole. I don't tell anyone that. I don't want to be the man whose tools cry. It's enough to be the man who went downstairs and asked a wall to explain itself. Every few weeks, I go back to the old parish to say hello to Father Aldo and to pretend I'm just checking the stability of the mountings. I go to the crypt and I stand far back first because I learned you should let a room decide whether you're company before you walk into it. The angel is the same. She's not the same. On some days, if a bus on the street throws a light down the stairs, she looks as if someone has called her name and she's just about to be bothered enough to answer. The tear is there every morning. I wipe it away every evening I can, even when it's not my job. Some nights, after a summer thunderstorm, it comes back by dawn thicker, as if the dead are grieving harder for reasons I don't understand. We kept the plaques where people can touch them with their eyes. The bricked recess is dry most days. Some nights it's not. I can't tell anyone when it will be which. That's the kind of answer that breaks routines. I used to think solving things meant making them stop. Conservation teaches you a different kind of fixing. Sometimes you make a place where a problem can exist without wrecking what's around it. Sometimes you learn to hold a tear with a tissue until it teaches you how to carry its weight, not take it away. If you ask me what the tears are, I'll say the most cowardly true thing. They are tears. If you ask me whose, I will give you the only answer that doesn't collapse when you look at it head on. They belong to the names no one says out loud, and to the names people say in their heads when they need to borrow the dry parts of the day for a while. Last week, a tourist stood too close and took a picture with flash. The angel looked flat for a second in the glare, like something in a catalog. I said, "No flash, please," and the woman apologized in a language I barely know. After she left, I stood there and watched the light return to the room. The angel's lip gathered a drop. It took its time. It didn't care that I was watching. When it fell, it made the same small sound it always makes. I wiped it, and as my cloth touched the stone, the tiniest pressure brushed my knuckles like the lightest tapping from the other side of something old and patient. It could have been air. It could have been me. I tell myself that because otherwise I won't sleep. I don't mean this as a warning. I don't think anyone is in danger. That's the part that confuses the people who want magic to be a threat or a promise. This feels like neither. It feels like the part of the evening when the baker drags his tray and you think the day is over. But there are still sounds outside that aren't sales or news, and you realize people must be saying their names to no one in their kitchens. And someone somewhere is saying them back without making a show of it. It's also the part where the air tells you it knows more than you, which is both comfort and insult if you're a person who fixes things. I'm writing this because last night the church where I work now had a problem with a little statue in a side chapel. It's not marble. It's terracotta, the kind people brought to saints who looked like their uncles so they'd listen better. I saw under one eye where a glaze had pooled a darker shine. It was nothing. It was a trick of the lamp. I told myself that twice. Then the sound came from the radiator. That pressure equalizing hiccup, not sobbing. Just a quick breath that remembers how to. I wiped the terracotta with a dry cloth. The cloth came away with nothing on it. But when I laid it back in my bag and took out the chisel I used to adjust little wooden wedges, the handle left my skin with a faint taste on my lip when I rubbed my face without thinking. Salt. I washed my hands, and because it felt like the thing you're supposed to do, I went to the door and pushed it open so the air could move through the chapel and say what it wanted to say to the stone without me. When I turned back, way in the corner where the light doesn't like to go, I thought I saw a tiny run of damp under the terracotta eye. I didn't go closer. I didn't weigh it. I didn't call Elisa, who would have brought papers and science and comfort. I stood there and told the room everything I had done that day that I was proud of, and everything I had done that I wished I'd performed more gently. When I finished talking like a fool to old clay, a whisper moved through the church. It wasn't a word. It was the part of words you feel on your teeth. It came from behind me, from near my left shoulder again, exactly where a mouth would be if a friend finally came close enough to say they were still here. I didn't turn. The air changed. It tasted faintly of cold coins and the sweetness of the Arno just before rain. I wiped the terracotta again and there was nothing on the cloth. I know the difference between nothing and something that isn't mine to measure. If you go to Florence and you find the little parish off the part of town where the streets lean into each other, you'll see the angel if you're patient and polite. Don't ask the priest to play you recordings. He won't. Don't tell the volunteers that it's a hoax or a phenomenon. They won't argue with you. Stand at the top of the crypt stairs. Breathe like you're about to speak and changed your mind. If she's listening, you'll see it. Not a gush. Not a miracle that solves anything. Just the ordinary wetness of being a person with a face happening to stone. If you put your tongue to your teeth, you might taste it in the air. A mild brine, familiar. Like the part of every sad day that didn't turn to bitterness because someone touched your sleeve. I wipe it when I can. I don't know what happens on the mornings when I can't. I imagine the tear running down, forming a line that dries and leaves a map. I imagine the name she heard the night before still hovering there, like dust in a shaft of light. The only time I'm more afraid than when I'm in the crypt is when I wake up certain that I can hear that quiet sob from the other side of the wall, and the wall is my own apartment, my own chest. You can tell yourself whatever you want about pipes. It helps until the night comes when you don't have pipes to blame. The first time you stand in a room and the air shapes itself into grief you recognize, you learn how many names there are and how many of them you haven't heard. You learn that listening is a form of work you can't clock out of. It's almost morning as I write this. Outside, a tray scrapes and a cat makes the sound cats make when they're deciding whether to forgive you. In an hour, the crypt will be cool, and the same dust will lie where it fell 100 years ago, and people will lean in and pretend they're not counting breaths. I'll go and wipe her cheek. I'll tell her what I did yesterday and what I plan to do today, and I'll ask her to keep the names that don't fit in my mouth yet, just until I can say them without taking them away from someone else. Then I'll lock up and go upstairs and hear, very faintly behind me and a little to my left, the breath a room takes when it realizes someone has learned how to listen. I don't need anyone to believe me. I just need to sleep through a storm again without feeling like I'm lying under a sheet of wet canvas, while people I can't see argue about whether I'm dead yet. If this sounds melodramatic, fine. I'd laugh too, if I hadn't watched rain crawl out of the ground like a slow nosebleed. Last spring, I took a cheap flight to France to help my friend Elise film interviews with Second World War veterans and caretakers in Normandy. I'm not a historian. I'm a video editor with a decent camera, a few microphones, and a habit of saying yes to underpaid jobs if they get me out of my apartment. Elise is the ambitious one. She speaks better French than I do. Her pitch was a little documentary about memory, how the land keeps its own version of what happened long after the people are gone. We based ourselves in a small coastal town east of Bayeux, in a rental above a boulangerie that started banging trays at 4 a.m. The place smelled like butter and seaweed. When you stepped outside, the wind came straight off the channel and found your bones. People weren't unfriendly, but they were cautious. You said bonjour, they said bonjour, and then you had to earn the rest of the sentence. Our first 2 days were normal. We filmed a retired school teacher who still took his class to place flags on graves every June. We filmed a fisherman who claimed the sea returned dog tags like driftwood. We filmed polished rows of headstones and grass cut to the same height everywhere you looked. It felt respectful and a little unreal, like someone had pressed the whole countryside between sheets of glass. On day 3, Elise wanted to visit a smaller cemetery. Not the big one in Colleville or the famous cliffs. A local one, tucked behind a church where the marble wasn't trying to impress you. The caretaker there had agreed to meet us at noon after he finished his rounds. Elise had found his name through a teacher. When I asked why him, she said he answered his phone at night and his voice sounded like gravel. It had rained all morning in a steady, fine way that soaked everything without ever looking dramatic. Little silver threads beaded on the headstones and made the letters crisp. The caretaker was late, so we set up by ourselves. I put a lav mic on Elise's jacket. I checked batteries, then checked them again because cold does strange things to equipment. The only other person around was a woman in a raincoat tending a family plot. She nodded at us like we were there to measure the walls. When the caretaker arrived, he startled me because I didn't hear the gate. He just seemed to be closer than he should have been, like he'd put himself there. He was wiry and probably in his 60s, with the sort of posture that comes from being alone with fence posts and shovels. He introduced himself as Arnaud, and his handshake made my knuckles crack. "You want the story," he said to Elise in French. Everyone wants the story, but you say your camera is for the land? For the land, Elise said, and I could tell she was pleased. Not to make something sensational. No one can promise that, he said, and looked past us toward the low part of the cemetery where water always collected. But we try. We followed him along the gravel with the respectful clatter of people walking where they've been told to be careful. He showed us the thing we had come without knowing it to see. A single grave, white stone like its neighbors, but the rectangular patch of ground in front of it was bare. Not scorched, not dug up, just bare. Nothing sprouted there. The grass on either side grew thick and damp and healthy. But the rectangle in front of this stone was the color of dried tea leaves. And when rain pooled there, it turned the faintest pink at the edges. Elise and I looked at each other, and I saw the moment she recalculated her careful documentary into something with a hook. I wasn't immune either. My camera felt heavier and lighter at the same time. I started rolling. What are we looking at? Elise asked. A soldier, Arno said. Unknown. The stone says so. He tapped the top with his knuckle. When it rains hard, there is water here like everywhere. But from this place, sometimes... He paused, searching for a word. It seeps. Seeps what? I asked, because the camera doesn't ask things. It looks red, he said. People say blood and then it is finished because they like that word. I took samples. I took them twice. I paid for the test with my own money because I did not want the rumor to be the only truth. It is not blood. What is it? Iron, he said. Salt. Things from the ground and the sea. But they send me a paper saying hemoglobin 0, plasma 0, and the mark where they tick for human is empty. And yet, he leaned down and skimmed his palm over the soil like he could pet it. It smells like iron, it clings to your boots. When thunder comes from the sea, it comes up. If there are children here, I tell them go. The parents think I am a fool and then they come back without the children, so I prefer I tell it earlier. Elise looked like she wanted to ask him 100 questions all at once. Instead, she asked, how long? He straightened. Since I began. Maybe before. The old caretaker told me not to sleep in the cottage on nights when it comes. He said the walls talk. I thought he meant mice. The woman in the raincoat had drifted closer. She stood behind the rope that separated the path from the plots, like a theater-goer who knows not to cross a line. He tells you the part that doesn't scare him, she said. She introduced herself as Madame Rousseau and said her father was in the ground not far from where we stood, but the war had nothing to do with it. He'd been a mailman for 40 years. When my children were small, they played here, she said matter-of-factly, the way only people from a place talk about the strangest parts of it. We couldn't stop them. This is a village. The dead are neighbors. But on storm nights, even when they had fevers, they would wake before the thunder. They would say, someone is knocking in the earth, Mama, and they would ask me to open the door and let it in. That's folklore, Arno said, but he didn't look at her. He looked at the horizon where a gray line stitched sea to sky. Folklore is just the part we still say aloud. We filmed him while the wind worried at the mic and gulls cried like rusty hinges. I did a slow pan over the stone. The name line read, Soldat in Kanu. There were dates, but not the kind that told you when someone lived. They just indicated the year the body had been found and buried, 1944. A thin crack tracked down the front like a vein, probably from frost. The earth in front of it smelled like old pennies that had been kept in a pocket full of seawater. We asked if we could return at night, and Arnaud shrugged. It is a cemetery, he said. If you are respectful, you can be here. But if there is thunder and you think it is clever to stand close, it will teach you manners. Back at the apartment, we played our footage like we were checking on a sleeping child. The audio was clean enough. Arnaud looked like the kind of person people believed. Elise texted our lab friend in Rouen, Leia, asking if it would be ridiculous to bring a soil sample and how much that would cost. Leia texted back a shrug emoji and said bring it. She owed Elise for last year's crash couch. That evening we bought savory crepes and cider and argued about whether to film during a storm if one came. I said we should not be jerks and set our tripods in front of people's dead relatives. Elise agreed, and then smiled at me in the merciless way of friends who know you want something you're pretending you don't. We can be respectful and still be brave, she said. Find the angle, not the spectacle. The storm didn't make us decide. It made the decision for us. Sometime after midnight, rain began to stride down the street like a parade. The apartment windows rattled. The air changed. It felt charged, metallic, like you taste when you bite your tongue. I woke to find Elise sitting at the small kitchen table with her coat already on. "You don't have to come," she said, which meant she knew I would. The cemetery was a 10-minute walk. It took 20 because the wind shoved us back down the lanes. Our flashlights turned the rain into a million little threads we had to cut through. The gate creaked in the classic way, even though I had oiled it with my eyes earlier. We kept our lights low out of habit. The village on the far side of the wall glowed sodium orange. In the storm, the headstones looked like they were moving toward us in little steps. When we reached the unknown soldier's grave, we saw right away that Arnaud hadn't been telling a story to test our manners. Water gathered at the low point and had already formed a shallow mirror. In that mirror was a faint sway of red, the color you only notice on the second look. If you told me it was clay, I would have believed you. If you told me it was rust, I would have believed that too. But none of those things explained the smell. Elise smelled it at the same time I did. We looked at each other and I knew we were making the same face. It's not even a smell you need your nose to identify. It sits on your tongue. Iron. Salt. Like standing next to something living that has been waiting too long. We set one tripod back to avoid stepping on any plots. We didn't whisper because whispering in a place like that feels louder than talking. Rain hammered on the stones like it wanted in. I clicked the camera on and watched the histogram breathe. The audio meter trembled. Elise looked up at the sky and then at the grave and then at me with the same tight little smile she used when a train was late, and we would miss an interview unless she ran faster than the day allowed. "There," she said, but she wasn't pointing at the water. She pointed at the stone. At first I didn't see it because my eyes were full of rain. Then I realized there was a darker crescent under the inscription, where the porous surface was drinking. The crack down the front had a thin red lip now, like clay dust had been rubbed into it. The little mirror of water at the base was growing, not just from what fell from the sky, but from a slow bleed up through the earth. I heard footsteps then and spun, almost slipping. A man's silhouette stood between rows with a hood pulled up, and I was halfway to an apology when he lifted a hand and I recognized Arnaud. "I told you it would teach you manners," he said. He didn't look angry. He looked like someone who had come to take his dog out in bad weather, because that's when the dog wanted to walk. He carried a lantern. It should have made the scene feel old-fashioned, but instead it made it feel more like we were in the present, and everything else was the part pretending. "Do you hear it?" he asked. At first I thought he meant the rain, but then the thunder came in from the sea, low and enormous, and under it there was a different sound, like a drum hit behind a closed door. Not loud, not cinematic. A flat percussive knock. It happened again. It found a rhythm. In the corner of my audio meter, I saw the quiet spikes. Elise moved closer to the tripod, and I almost told her to stop. But she wasn't stepping on the grave. She was steadying the camera the way you steady your breath before you say a new name. "I hear it," I said. "It is quieter now than when I was a young man," Arnaud said. "Or I am more deaf." But the first time I heard it, I thought, what fool is in my cemetery making jokes? Then I went to tell him to go, and there was no one. I do not let myself think too long about what it sounds like. It starts to fit in places where it should not fit. "Like hands," the voice behind us said. And I realized Madame Rousseau had followed the storm too. She had an umbrella and sensible boots and looked like someone who would scold a wave. "It sounds like hands," she said. The rain changed pitch, like gravel slid across tin. The red in the water was stronger now, not bright, just unquestionably not clear. The smell got into my mouth and sat there. I felt my heart trying to drum along with the low percussion, and the mismatch made me breathless. I glanced down to see whether the water was touching my shoes. It wasn't, but my laces were stained the color of dry brick. The thunder rolled again and the low knocking broke into something else. If you've ever heard someone pounding a rug with a wooden beater, that's the closest I can bring you. Not cinematic gunfire, not the sharp cracks you hear in movies. Blunt impacts, several. Then a pause. Then several more, in a staggered unison that tricked you into thinking it was far away until it arrived inside your chest. The rain smeared everything and we couldn't see the far fence, but I realized the sound wasn't coming from any one direction. It was in the ground. It was in the stone. It was in the red water. Arnaud had set the lantern on the gravel. Its flame stuttered with each new roll, and I found my hands doing something I don't even remember choosing. They were cupped at my sides like I might catch something that fell, drop it, and pretend that made sense. Elise whispered, "Keep rolling." And I heard her voice shake and congratulated. myself for noticing, because the part of me that belongs to cameras still believes objectivity is a jacket you can put on. Something thudded closer than before, not at our feet. To our left, 3 rows over. It had weight to it. Another behind us. The wind shoved rain against my back, and I flinched like I expected a hand to land on my shoulder. There were no hands, only the neat white stones and the quivering elliptical pools in front of them, and the little lace of red that touched the edges. Not everywhere. Not enough to make me say a word I'm not saying even now. Back, Arno said, not loudly. If it comes up fast, it carries the soil with it. Not deep, but enough to make you stupid. We stepped back together like we were in a dance we had rehearsed. I had the absurd thought that if I slipped and fell, I would spend the rest of my life apologizing to stones for putting my living weight where they had an agreement with the dead. The water at the unknown soldier's grave rose into a shallow, shifting skin that bulged with each thunder roll. Something tapped the stone from the inside. Not a knock. A lighter gesture that made the flame in the lantern lean. If you've ever felt a trapped moth flick against glass, imagine that without wings. I realized I was hearing words. Not clearly, not in any one language. The way you hear words when you're in a foreign station in the announcement's layer. A syllable that could be here or there. A word that might be present or counted. Halise's lips were moving, and I think she was praying. But she grew up atheist, and the prayers we inherit are sometimes the ones we make in a hurry. Do not repeat anything, Arno said, even to be kind. Do not answer it. He said it like he was scolding a child for saying their name to a salesman on the phone. If you answer once, it believes you live in the conversation. A gust shifted the rain and blew the lantern smoke into my face. It had that old paper smell, oil and dust. I blinked tears. When I cleared my eyes, there were boot impressions in the gravel 2 plots down, shallow, filling instantly with water. They faced toward us and then, in the next roll, away. If you're looking for footprints that tell you a story, you can always find them. That's how minds work. But my camera wasn't a mind, and when we played the footage later, the impressions were there whether we wanted them or not. We kept stepping back until the gravel met the path by the wall. The gate was open behind us. I had been thinking in that useless animal way that a gate mattered. It didn't. The sound didn't care about fences. It thickened and thinned with the thunder. The red in the water shook itself into thin veils and settled again. Once, just once, I thought I saw a darker skein rise up like a ribbon, and then vanish as if the surface had smoothed itself on purpose. That's the one image I don't trust. I could have blinked. I could have made it because the rest didn't need me to. Arno took his cap off and put it under his arm. I don't like to be here when it is strongest, he said, not apologizing. You are free people and you can stand and look. But if it begins to feel like time is being counted, if you begin to count with it, go. Elise nodded, but her camera hand was steady. We stayed until the storm's spine moved inland, and the thunder separated from the knocks the way a train pulls away from a platform and reveals the person who had been standing behind it the whole time. We were the last ones to turn. Madame Rousseau had gone without a goodbye. Arno waited until we crossed the threshold, then swung the gate so the latch kissed metal. It did not slam. The storm had manners when it left. Back at the apartment, we stripped rain out of our clothes and hung them wherever we could. The bakery below us was already awake. I stood by the heater with my socks off and watched a thin red line on my shoelaces bead and refuse to rinse out. You know how white fabric takes stains like a confession? This was the reverse. The laces stayed gray, but the beads refused to become water. We sent the clip to Leia with a note that said, "Is there anything here except, ugh?" She replied with a string of punctuation and told us to bring her a small sample if we went back in daylight. She warned us not to dig, just to come away with what the rain left on the path. I slept in the morning and dreamt I was a letter someone couldn't get the sealing wax to stick to. We went back at noon. The sky had exhausted itself, and the crows in the churchyard sounded like the same note trying on different bodies. There were no marks on the stone except the long-heeled crack. The rectangle of earth was bare, damp, and this is in my head, I know, watchful. Arno was there with a push broom, combing grit off the paths like a barber who loves his job. He nodded as if we hadn't been idiots. Nothing to see, he said, which was exactly the kind of thing someone says when they know you saw enough. If you want your dirt, take it from the path. Don't insult the poor man by stealing his bedclothes. Elise crouched and scooped a spoon of reddish grit into a sterile tube Leia had given us years ago for a different job. I recorded the moment, another absurd habit. proof that we hadn't been greedy. I didn't step off the path. I didn't want the soles of my shoes to rest on that rectangle. It felt like standing on a closed eyelid. We took the sample to Rouen on the train. Leia met us with coffee and a lab coat over street clothes. She joked that we were trying to get her fired and then did her best to make it science. I watched her spin the grit in a little machine, while a grad student asked me if I meant it when I said the smell had a taste. We sat on plastic chairs and pretended that waiting was a skill you could practice. Leia came back with a printout and a face that had been forced into neutral 5 minutes earlier. "It's iron, yes," she said. "Iron and sodium and chloride. Manganese, traces, nothing that tells me red is a person. Hemoglobin would not last in that matrix, not after that much rain." She paused, and then she did the thing good friends do. She told us the extra part even though it would keep her up. "But there is an organic signature I can't place. Not blood, not plant. It's like something that was once close to cells and then asked to be farther away. That's not a scientific sentence. Don't quote me." We didn't. We filmed a couple more interviews over the next 2 days. We pretended to be normal filmmakers. But rain kept coming off the water in flayed sheets, and every time thunder rolled in from the horizon, I found myself counting under my breath like I had to pay a toll. On the last afternoon, Arno let us film him closing up the small tool shed where he kept his broom and his oil can, and a tin of biscuits that probably didn't taste of anything except oldness. "I won't stop you if you want to come back for the anniversary week," he said, meaning June, meaning crowds and flags and the kind of speeches that make cameras happy. "But if there is a storm, stay in the church. The roof is new. The walls are old enough to remember that rain is not a friend." We promised to be respectful. We meant it. On the train to Paris, Elise and I watched our footage again. The microphones had picked up the thunder as a long belly sound. The knocks were there too, skittering like moths. Once, briefly, a word shaped itself in the noise. It could have been present. It could have been here. It could have been a word a man says when his name is read and someone waits for him to answer. Back home editing, the smell followed the footage. I know that isn't possible. I know smells don't travel through pixels. But more than once I swore the room tasted like pennies when I hit play. I washed my shoelaces in detergent, then vinegar, then nothing. The beads remained in the way that dreams remain when your day is too quiet. Leia emailed saying she'd run another analysis and gotten the same nothing that wasn't nothing. She attached a photo of the printout with the boxes marked 0. In the corner she'd written a note. "It isn't blood, but it's also not blood. Please don't make me explain that on camera." 2 weeks later, Elise sent me a clip someone had uploaded to a local forum. It was a phone video of the cemetery at dusk. Kids' voices. The breathless laughter of people who know they'll get scolded if they're caught. The camera bobbled, then steadied on the unknown soldier's grave. The earth in front of it was already dark with rain. One of the kids said in French, "Say present." Another said, "Don't be a jerk." Thunder rolled. The sound that followed wasn't dramatic. It was heavy and certain and close. The phone jerked down to the gravel, and in the last frame before it turned to rectangles of color and panic, the water made a small movement like someone just under the surface had lifted their face to speak. Elise told me she wrote to Arnaud. He didn't answer. The teacher we'd interviewed said he'd taken a few days. "He doesn't like that the children dare the stones," she said. "He will come back when the sky stops making him angry." Madame Rousseau, when asked, simply said, "We do not say the word if there is thunder." She would not explain which word. We finished the edit without narration, because everything we wrote felt either too brave or too cowardly. We sent a cut to Elise's grant committee. We slept badly. Whenever a storm came in my city, I woke at the first low roll and laid there wide-eyed, counting seconds not between lightning and thunder, but between the knocks that arrived under the house like a neighbor using the shared wall. I stopped hanging clothes on the radiator because the heat made the room smell metallic. I woke one morning with dirt on the sheets where my feet had been. You can explain that any way you like. I washed them twice. The dirt returned the next time it rained. Last week, a small padded envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a photocopy of a test result sheet, the same type Leia had printed for us, but the language was different. Official French with the particular phrasing of a lab that's trying to be polite to a non-customer. Hemoglobin, none detected. Plasma proteins, none detected. Organic volatile compounds present unclassified. At the bottom, in handwriting that I think might be Arnaud's, There was a sentence in French that could be read two ways depending on where you put the breath. Not the blood of a man, or not the blood of only a man. Another slip of paper fell out. A torn corner of a calendar page with a date circled in June and the word "orage" written beside it. Storm. If I stop here, it sounds like a moral. I didn't write this for a moral. I wrote it because last night the weather broke over my building, and I lay on my back in the dark with the window open, telling myself that thunder is just air relearning its place. I closed my eyes and counted to 4 between the flash and the roll. On 3, something tapped the inside of the wall. On 4, something else tapped again. I held my breath and it tapped a third time politely, with the patience of a person who has waited by a door too long to be offended by your delay. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. The rain lifted the smell of iron and salt out of the radiator like steam, and somewhere far off along a coast I didn't have to see to picture, the grass in front of a single stone refused to grow. In the morning I found my shoes by the door, the laces beaded with that same impossible dull red, even though I hadn't worn them since I came home. I know what the caretaker would say if I called him. He'd say don't answer. He'd say storms are not for conversations. He'd say the land keeps its own version. I won't go back in June, that's what I tell myself. But sometimes, half awake, I hear the roll begin far out on the horizon of my city's sky, and my mouth shapes a word that is not yes, not no. Just a syllable the body uses to say someone is here. I swallow it and wait for it to dissolve, and it doesn't. It sits there like a coin on the tongue, tasting of iron and salt, until the thunder turns away and I am alone again with the steady, patient knock. I'm not posting this to be dramatic. I just need to write it out so I can sleep without jumping at every little sound from the radiator. If you've ever spent a winter in Krakow, you know how the cold seems to memorize your name. It sits on the windowsills, crawls under doors, and waits in tram shelters like a stray dog. I'm the guy who looks after one of the older cemeteries on the edge of the city, the kind with iron angels and names that have softened into stone. It's not glamorous work. I shovel paths, clear branches after windstorms, and tell tourists to stop setting candles in the middle of walkways. Nights are quiet, and if I'm honest, I like that. I liked hearing the city far off. Someone laughing, a distant tram, the Vistula breathing out mist, while the graves stayed still and ordinary. It was the second week of December when the first snow came heavy and mean. We got that wet kind that turns your coat hems into ropes. Antek, the other caretaker, had gone home early because his son had a fever. I stayed to lock up. The florist across the street, Ewa, passed me a thermos of tea and a smile that tried to be cheerful. She's the kind of person who makes funeral colors look warm. We chatted about the forecast. She had a box of glass candle covers under one arm, and her scarf tucked so high you could only see her eyes. "Don't let them burn themselves," she said, nodding toward a couple lighting votives in a gust. I told her I'd make the rounds and went in with my headlamp and the big keys that knock against your leg like a set of irons. The snow was like a blanket that someone had forgotten to shake out. It covered everything in thick folds, softening the crosses, muting the iron fences. When it falls like that, sound gets strange. Your footsteps are louder than they should be, but everything else is swallowed, like the whole place is laughing behind a hand. I'd just reached the old section near the low wall, the part with headstones dated in the 1800s. When I heard a small bell ring, it wasn't far. It wasn't from the gate or a bicycle or someone's pocket. It came from the ground, and not like a clank or a jingle, but a true bell note, thin, high, and oddly polite. It rang once and stopped. I stood there with my breath fogging the beam of the headlamp and told myself it was a bit of metal under the snow catching the wind. Then it rang again. I could feel it in my teeth, that little vibration like an old spoon in a glass. I walked toward the sound, the snow crunching under my boots, and the bell went quiet. I waited. My headlamp showed only white, marred here and there where the snow had fallen around shrubs and little iron fences. The graves looked like sleeping people under quilts. Nothing moved. I took 2 more steps and the bell rang a third time. There's a story every caretaker hears. The safety bells. Back when people were terrified of being buried alive after cholera or typhus, they'd rig coffins with strings that ran up through pipes to little bells on posts. If you woke up down there and tugged, the bell would call someone to dig you out. Romantic or dreadful, depending on your imagination. Most of those bell posts went the way of old roofs, rotten, removed, forgotten. But the piping? Some of it remained, sunk and invisible. I told myself I was hearing history. Ice shifting on metal. Maybe a branch tapping a rusted remnant. To prove it, I started brushing snow away with my gloved hands. The cold bit through the wool like teeth. After a minute, I felt iron. I cleared more and uncovered a low black post no taller than my knee. At the top, half encased in ice, was a bell the size of my palm. It was dull with age, the clapper green with oxidized copper. A thin pipe ran down into the ground beside it. "Okay," I said out loud because speaking makes things behave. "All right." The bell rang a fourth time, sharp enough that I flinched and looked for a hand that wasn't there. The pipe's opening was filled with frozen slush. I crouched, leaned closer, and thought I heard a breath come from it, but it might have been my own bounced back. I radioed Antec because being wrong with a witness is better than being right alone. He didn't pick up. I felt ridiculous, crouched in a snowbank talking to a bell. I pulled my glove off and put my fingertips against the pipe. Nothing. The cold burned like a lighter under the nail bed. I blew into the pipe and watched my own breath come back at me, warmer than the air. When I stood to go grab the mini shovel from the shed, the beam of my headlamp crossed the headstone. The name was faded to the point of being a suggestion, but I could make out Susanna with a Z that curled like a music note. The date below had the kind of long tail that means 18-something. That's as precise as I got because the bell gave a fifth ring. Not a random chime, a ring that sounded like someone with poor patience. I dug. Not because I believed anyone was down there, obviously, because weird things deserve a reason. The snow gave way to a crust of ice. The shovel rang against stone, then earth, then something softer where the pipe might have made a channel. I went down to my elbows, breath coming hard now, snow packing into my sleeves, and found the pipe, rusted as thin as a pencil with its end buried in compacted soil. There was a length of old cord threaded through the pipe. It was brittle, discolored string, the kind you'd use on packages. It should have run straight down. It didn't. I followed it with my fingers as far as it would go and realized there were two strings. The old fragile one that died a meter down, and a newer one, cotton, still rough and strong, running up and out, through the pipe and under the snow toward the head of the grave. I refocused my light and brushed away snow from the top of the stone, expecting to find a post or a tie. Instead, the new string ran to a bouquet, fresh enough that you could smell it through the cold, maybe 2 or 3 hours old. White roses and fir, the kind Iwa makes in winter so the greenery doesn't look depressing. There was a little card tucked into it, no name. Just a neat pen line, as if someone had changed their mind before writing anything. I took the bouquet in one hand and the string in the other, and lifted gently. The bell sang. The string had been tied around the stems underneath the wrap and fed through the old pipe. If you pulled back on the bouquet, the bell rang. I stood in the falling snow with that stupid bouquet and realized my heart was going like I'd run a block. I set it back exactly where it had been and looked around. The path I'd made to get here was the only one. No footprints came the other way, but that didn't mean much. Snow erases a lot in an hour. I went to Ewa's shop with my hat in my hands like a man who'd broken something at home. She frowned, handed me a towel, and listened. Maybe a prank, she said, but her voice didn't settle on it. Who ordered the bouquet, I asked. She scrolled her phone with a gloved finger and shook her head. Cash? Man in a gray coat who didn't take his hands out of his pockets. Said for Susanna and pointed. That bought me a long stare. You shouldn't go digging at night, she added softer. People hear bells where they want to hear them. I went back anyway because I had keys and because leaving a bell tied to flowers felt like breaking a promise to a room I didn't remember making. The snow had thickened. The bell rang once, but from farther off this time. Same tone, different place. I followed sound over the uneven white to another old marker half swallowed by you. There was no post, just a bell laid flat on the snow like someone had set it down, tested it, and wandered off. A string ran from it under the snow, and when I traced it, my fingers met a second bouquet. You know how darkness can look crowded? That's how it felt. As if the space around me was full of people holding their breath to see if I noticed them. When Antec called back, his voice was sleepy and full of a child's cough. You're joking, he said after I explained. He didn't mean it like a question. Go home, I'll come early. It's the wind in your head, he said. and made me promise to lock the gate and leave the rest until morning. Morning didn't fix it. The snow had a skin of ice that cracked like sugar underfoot. There were 3 bouquets now in that section, all fresh. On one, the card was blank again except for that single line. On another, there were letters pressed but not finished. Zook and a halt. Iwa swore she hadn't made them, and I believed her because she looked offended at the craftsmanship. "We'd have wired the stems cleaner," she muttered. Touching the sloppy wrap the way you touch a stain. We started checking the obvious. The gate camera, which was buried in frost and had been flickering for days. The guard's sign-in log, which showed only me and a delivery guy with candles that morning. The small doors in the wall where we keep tools all locked. An old priest from the parish, Father Marek, came by to bless a grave and let himself get pulled into our worry without much protest. He tapped the bell with a knuckle and smiled like a man hearing a song from childhood. "We keep ties to the dead so we don't get lonely," he said, which wasn't helpful at all. Antek and I agreed to remove the string from the first grave just to stop it. We'd explain to the family if any surfaced. I took a photo first, habit, documentation, then untied the cotton, which was simple and recent, no fancy knot. The bell sat silent in the daylight like any object. I was half angry with myself for giving it so much power when the sound came again, not from the post this time, but from somewhere under the drift near my left boot. I dug with both hands and found the second bell, the one laid flat. It had a new bit of string on its clapper, and that string disappeared into the snow toward the low wall. I followed, and the line went up and over the stones like a child's kite, down the other side and across to a narrow strip of earth by the maintenance shed, where a bouquet sat propped against the door. The tag on that one had writing. Not a full name, just a last initial. Z, and in the corner, smaller, almost embarrassed, Swucha. Listening, I carry a little notebook for things like which candles go where on All Saints, and which shrubs are due a cut. I wrote Swucha and stared at it until the word lost its shape. The next days were a loop. We'd cut string. Bells would ring somewhere else. Iwa would swear at whoever was copying her arrangements. An old neighbor from across the lane, a woman named Zofia who walked with her coat undone no matter how cold, told me she'd seen a man out by the wall the night before, standing very still with his hands in his pockets. He looked at my windows like he was fixing them with his eyes, she said. I almost waved, but I didn't. The police sent a patrol car through once and radioed me to say the gates were locked. No footprints obvious. Everything normal if you ignored the bells. They suggested teenagers. I suggested teenagers who can tie knots like sailors in sub-zero weather. We compromised on troublemakers, which is what you say when you don't want to say strange. On the 4th night, the temperature dropped hard. The air felt like glass. My breath came out in a shape and held there. I pushed the big gate shut and heard 3 bells at once. It wasn't wind. It wasn't the keys at my hip. It was a chord. 2 high, 1 lower, that seemed to come from the far corners of the old section and the strip near the shed. I turned off my headlamp to listen better. The sky had that ugly pink you get from city light bouncing off snow. The cemetery changed when the lamp went out. The darkness became one thing, not many, and the sound swam in it. A tug, a bell, a pause. Another. Like a call-and-response choir made of spoons and copper, the hair on my arms lifted under the thermal. I clicked the lamp back on and moved fast. Snow grabbed at my shins. My boots squeaked. At the first grave, the bell string had been knotted to a bouquet that wasn't there. The place where it had sat was a wet, round hole, melted. At the second, the bell lay with its clapper partly iced, as if someone had poured warm water on it to free the tongue. At the shed door, the bouquet with the Z had been replaced by one with no letter at all and a thin white ribbon trailing away across the snow like a tail. I followed the ribbon. It led me in a slow loop through the oldest section, past a statue of an angel whose nose had gone, past a stone lamb, past the small corner where the poor of long ago are stacked and marked only NN, Niznani, unknown. The ribbon crossed itself a couple of times as if whoever laid it down had paced to think about something. It ended at a low iron cross so simple you miss it even when you're standing there. There was no name, just a year stone sunk at the base, 1891. I knelt and the ice squeaked under my weight. There was a piece of twine tied to the cross. The other end disappeared under the snow toward a patch of earth that had been cleared recently. The kind of clearing you do when you mean to plant, not dig. On the little metal marker, a temporary thing we use until families choose a stone, someone had written my name. First and last. Sharpie, hurried, and very correct. I know how that reads. Believe me. I stood up so fast my vision tunneled. My mind did the obvious math. Anyone could have written that. Anyone could order a bouquet and ask for a name. Names are public when you sign in and out with the council. My jacket has a badge. Logic is a flimsy blanket when your name is tied to a cross, and bells are speaking around you like a room of people trying to get you to look at them. I tore the twine loose from the iron and felt it travel through the snow like a live wire. The bells rang, all of them, in a pattern that wasn't random. 1, 2, pause, 1, pause, 2. Like knocking, like listening. I thought of the word on the tag. Swoocha. I went to Father Marek's little office the next morning with a stupid twine in my pocket and asked for stories. Not ghosts, not warnings. Facts. He made coffee as if we were going to be there until spring and told me what I already half knew. In the epidemics, they tied bells. In hard winters, people heard things that were wind. Later, people heard what they had read about. Some families kept little habits. A ribbon on a holiday, a candle at midnight, a coin in the pocket of a child for the ferryman. Traditions that made grief feel like work instead of drowning. And the bouquets? I asked. He shrugged. The living send signals to each other with flowers all the time, he said. Why not the dead? That night I slept at the caretaker's flat above the office because going home felt like leaving a kettle on the stove. I lay with my jacket over the chair and the headlamp on the table and listened to the heating tick. Around 2 a.m, my phone buzzed with a photo from Iwa. A bouquet, snow on the petals like sugar, and a tag with my name spelled right. Under it, just 2 words, Dla Ciebie. For you. I went to the window without putting on boots. The courtyard was a pale square, marked with my footprints from earlier and the foxes I'd seen skirting the bins. At the far edge, by the shed, a shadow moved. It was tall but hunched, a heaviness in the middle like a winter coat. It was still the way furniture is still, so still it insists on being real. Then the shed door clicked once and the shadow turned its head toward the office window, as if it had heard me with its back. I ducked so fast I hit my knee and had to sit on the floor with my teeth clamped together to stop the involuntary noise people make when pain surprises them. When I looked again, the courtyard was blank. The shed door was closed. The fox prints were filled with drift. I went down with the big light. The lock held. Inside, the tools hung obediently, red handles bright against pegboard. On the workbench lay the second bell, the one that had been flat on the snow, cleaned, polished, the clapper moving freely. Beside it was a coil of cotton twine and, neatly arranged like a lesson, 3 knots tied in a row. A bowline, a clove hitch, and a common overhand. The kind you teach scouts. The kind my father taught me when I was little and he was still the man who took me to the river to fish. There was a bouquet on the chair. White roses and fur. The tag said just the letter Z, and in the lower corner, a small straight line drawn so lightly I almost missed it. I sat in the shed with the smell of cold iron and cut flowers and tried to be brave enough to be simple. Maybe I had a stalker. That would be a story the police could hold. Maybe someone was angry about a grave I'd trimmed wrong. Maybe there was a ritual here I hadn't respected. Those explanations fit if you made the edges touch. The bells didn't ring that night. The quiet had weight. When the sky went white with morning, I felt like I'd been holding my breath without knowing. We closed the cemetery for 2 days because of the storm. The city sent us a message with little snowflake emojis, which made me laugh for 30 seconds and then feel sad for a long time. In the shut days, I stayed in the flat and watched the courtyard through the curtain, sleeping like a cat. All at once, easy to wake. Antek came by with pastries and stories about his son's fever breaking. Iwa left a bag of candles on the stoop without ringing. Father Marek texted a prayer hands emoji and the word spokoj, which means peace but also quiet and also calm. Polish makes you choose your meaning by your tone. On the 3rd night, the bells started again. Not from outside. From the radiator. I know how it sounds. But there is a space in those old metal ribs that can sing like a throat, when air slides over it a certain way. That's what I told myself when a high, small note threaded through the flat. It came in little pulses like someone tugging a rope on the other side of the wall. I pressed my ear to the radiator and heard, very faint, a scraping. It's a common sound in old buildings. It's what pipes do. But I couldn't keep my mind from that word. Listening. and the way the bells had called and answered. I went down in socks and a sweater because sometimes your brain wants ritual more than warmth. The courtyard snow had set like ceramic. The fox's prints from 2 nights ago had become fossils. By the shed door there was a bouquet and no footprints. I picked it up, and the bell over near Susanna's old post rang with a bright, cheerful tone, as if this were all a misunderstanding. The string went from the bouquet to the bell through the old pipe, and then, not down into earth but back across the snow toward the office wall, where it disappeared into a crack at the base of the bricks. I crouched and brushed it clear with my hand. The string had been carefully pushed into the tiny gap where mortar had fallen out. The gap ran under the wall, and I realized with that cold-in-the-teeth feeling, up through the crawl space in the radiator shaft. Someone had threaded the building. I followed it inside, across the storage room with its smell of polish and damp cardboard, up the stairs where my footsteps sounded too loud, into the flat where the radiator ticked like a metronome. The string came up along the corner where paint had bubbled, hugged the wall so tightly you'd miss it if you weren't looking, and ended at the vase on my table. I hadn't noticed the vase. That seems impossible now. Who misses a vase full of water sitting on their table? But there it was, heavy with condensation beginning to cling where the cold met the room's weak heat. The end of the string was tied around its neck. There was no bouquet in it. Only water, and at the bottom something pale. I reached in because I'm an idiot, or because to stop now would have made me someone who tells stories instead of a person who did his job. My fingers touched paper. I hauled it up dripping and unfolded it over the sink. It was a photocopy. I recognized the format. The city archive's old death registers use this script half print, half flourish. At the top, the name Susanna had been inked over again as if someone wanted to be sure I could read it. The year matched the little iron cross. In the column for cause, where your new brain wants to find typhus or consumption, there was a word I had to sound out twice. Wickwadzania. Exposure. Cold. That's it. No romance. No waking under dirt. No bride with a ribbon around her neck. She froze. Maybe on a bench, maybe at a gate, maybe on a street where warmth was a sound behind glass. The bell had been there in case, but what she needed was hands on her, and there were none that night. I went to put the paper back in the vase like that would return the day to factory settings. The bell in the courtyard rang once, and then, far off, another answered. I stood at the window and watched my own breath fog the glass and saw nothing move but the slow fall of the small snow. The kind that doesn't show itself in the air so much as gather on your sleeve while you're thinking. In the morning, I told Antek everything like I was reporting a spill. He shook his head and told me to get a day off before I started seeing faces and knots in wood. Iwa listened with her jaw set and then handed me a bouquet so beautiful it hurt. "Take this to Susanna," she said. "No string. Just flowers. We can't fix old nights, but we can be less ridiculous about the new ones." I did as she asked. I stood in the snow over that very old woman and said her name like I was introducing myself. I set the flowers down and nothing rang. The silence felt open, not empty. I'd like to end it there. It would be tidy. We did the decent thing. The bell stopped. The city continued with its normal sounds. Wheels on rails, a kettle sigh, a child asking for one more minute. Some nights are kind, but last night, this is why I'm writing at 3 a.m. with my hands shaking so hard I'm hitting the wrong keys. I woke to the sound of a bell from under my bed. Not loud, not horror movie loud. A small insistent note like a spoon tapped twice on a mug to call a room to listen. I turned on the lamp and saw the end of a white ribbon peeking from under the frame, trailing toward the radiator. I didn't touch it. I sat with my feet on the cold floor and the light on and the taste of iron in my mouth and thought about how you can tie a bell to anything if you're patient, and if what you want is an ear. The room didn't feel crowded. It felt attentive. That's worse somehow. The sound came again, softer this time. The radiator breathed. Somewhere inside the wall, something scraped like a clapper finding its home. I slept in the chair because that felt less like an invitation. If you're reading this for a lesson, I don't have one. If you want a solution, cut all the strings, tear up the pipe, call the police until they roll their eyes. I'll do those things tomorrow because I have to do something, but there's a part of me that thinks the bells aren't a trick. They're not even a story. They're a question waiting for someone to answer the way you answer a phone by saying hello. Outside, the snow just started again, fine and steady. The city will go pink and the fox will write its loops and we will all pretend at warmth in our separate rooms. The small note under the bed has gone quiet, either because it got what it wanted or because it is patient. I am sitting still, listening. And when I hold my breath for just a second, I swear I hear another bell far away answer back, as if something out there has noticed that I know its name. I don't care if anyone believes me. I just need to put this somewhere it doesn't look back at me from a glass screen. If I tell it out loud to friends, I hear my own voice shaking and it feels like I'm feeding it. Words on a page feel safer. Take from that what you want. I work nights sometimes. Not glamorous nights, no clubs, no busy kitchens, just keys and locks and timers and dust. I'm the guy they call when old buildings are being fixed up and someone needs to count the tools at midnight and make sure no one with spray paint or a crowbar slips in. The job this spring was a small labyrinth of burial chapels near Granada, up the hill where the air smells colder than the city below. They were renovating a family mausoleum, 19th century carved names worn smooth by hands and wind. My wife Elena says I always bring home the smell of lime and old paper when I do these jobs. She hates it, but she likes that I'm home for breakfast. We live in the lower Albaycin, where the streets pitch and roll like old bones and the neighbors sweep their steps every morning. We're new enough that people still call me El Chico de las Llaves, the kid with the keys. I'm 36, my crew was small. During the day there were masons and a conservator, a woman named Alina who looked at faded angels with a magnifying glass and whispered like a doctor. At night it was usually just me, a portable radio, and sometimes my friend Mateo if he wanted a quiet shift to get away from his 2 toddlers. Mateo is the kind of guy who can fall asleep sitting on a paint bucket. Wake me if the dead ask for coffee, he'd mumble. Our supervisor, Don Ernesto, wore a scarf even in June and made good coffee he never shared. Background people drift in every story I know, but they matter. The day guard, Rosa, always left 10 minutes early to catch the last bus. The neighbor across from our flat, Senora Pilar, likes to stand in her robe at strange hours and ask me if I've seen Los Niños del Patio, the patio children, which is an Albaycin way of calling neighborhood kids ghosts without making anyone nervous. Details like that sound cute when you don't sleep there. It's different when you do. The mausoleum wasn't in the big cemetery by the Alhambra. This was older ground, tucked behind a church that rarely opens except on feast days. You unlock a metal gate, then a wooden door that sticks at the bottom, and you step down 3 shallow stone steps into a rectangle of cool air. The main crypt has a black and white floor and a ceiling painted like night. The side chapels are narrow and shallow, with iron grills and votive shells. The name cut above the main slab was Familia Azara, but the Z was almost a 2 from age. The wall lamps are new, retro-looking brass with LEDs that hum so softly you'd swear you were hearing your own blood. We were restoring a flower relief that had chipped away in a corner. That's what they said we were doing. It's never just one thing. Old places make a list of your excuses. The first week was fine. I'd do a round, check each window grate, tap the moisture meter against my palm like I knew what I was doing, and jot down things I'd tell Don Ernesto in the morning. Drip in SE corner, call plumber, motion sensor by sacristy false triggers, loose tile, fix before someone dies and sues us. I'd bring a sandwich, Elena's tortilla and wax paper, and a thermos of bitter coffee she swears is good if you pretend it's chocolate. I'd send her a photo sometimes, a joke about my office, a bench under leaded glass. If you work alone long enough, you get a 6th sense for the building exhaling. The air changes with tiny weather. The LEDs warm up and smell like hot coins. Even the harboring of dead names feels as normal as a library after a day. It was the second week when small nonsense started to collect. The key fob on the inner door would blink red for me like I was a stranger, then green a second later with a polite beep. The motion sensor light in the left chapel would kick on while I was standing in the right one. The radio caught the midnight news with a fuzz as if someone had set a wet towel on it. I chalked a line one night across the base of the relief we were supposed to finish by Friday. A silly trick, my way of keeping track of the cleaning around an awkward crack. The next morning the chalk wasn't there. Chalk dissolves. People brush. Someone must have wiped it. But I always chalk on the hidden side, the corner you have to duck to see. I told myself I'd be less precious about my private little measures. My job is to document, not to prove ghosts to myself like a teenager. Tuesday night, Mateo joined me for the last few hours. He had that dusty, sleepy face. "Anything weird?" he asked in a tone that hoped for no, and secretly begged for a story for WhatsApp. I shrugged. It's fine. It creaks like a theater. He lay down on a mat in the sacristy to mind the security monitor remote. We have an app for the cameras, 4 bubbles on my phone. Main crypt, left chapel, right chapel, entry. The images are a little too crisp, like the cameras know more detail than your eye does and it wants to show off. At around 2 in the morning, I did my final round and locked up. Big key for big gate, smaller key for the wooden door that sticks, code for the alarm that chirps like a nervous bird. I watched Mateo shuffle down the slope to his car, rubbing his eyes. I walked home. Elena had left the lamp on in the living room and a bowl of cherries on the table. She was asleep on the sofa under a blanket that has been in her family since before she was born. I turned off the lamp and kissed her hair and listened to the street. Even at that hour, a scooter laughs, one last dog argues with a shadow, someone drops a bottle into a bin and it sounds like a bell. I showered the dust out of my nose. I climbed into bed and let my brain empty like a sink. I woke up at 6. It was still dim. I sometimes check the cameras when I wake up too early, not for fear. There are better things to be afraid of, but out of habit, the way some people check the weather or messages. The app was stuck spinning for a second. Then the main crypt camera bloomed into view. If you've ever looked at a room you know by heart through a lens, you'll know the feeling. It's like a postcard of your own kitchen. Empty, dust caught in the LED hum. The left chapel looked normal. The right chapel made me frown. The light bar on the wall was on, though I was sure I'd left all the auxiliary lights off. That was the smallest thing. On the entry camera, there was a woman. She stood inside the wooden door, not 3 meters from where I'd locked it. And at first I thought Rosa had forgotten something and come back. But Rosa wears a blue jacket with reflective strips and her hair in a bun. This woman wore black from throat to hem, the old kind of black that swallows light. Her skirt fell like a heavy curtain. She had a veil on, not like a bride, but like the photographs you sometimes see on postcards in antique shops. A 19th century widow's veil that ends at the chin with a little scallop. She was touching the wall with her gloved hand, fingertips brushing at the stone where the paint has dimmed. She didn't move like someone lost. She moved like someone checking if the wall was warm enough to sit against. The entry camera is angled high like a tiny balcony. She looked up toward it. The veil softened the shape of her face. My thumb hesitated. I zoomed with the tap. Her face was Elena's. I mean that in the most basic, awful way. The mouth I kissed, the small mole near the left eye, the little notch on the ear from when she was 6 and a dog snapped without meaning to, the cheekbones that make her look like she's listening even when she's the one talking. Her face exactly, set under a veil that belonged to another century. My first instinct was stupid and automatic. I called her. The phone rang in the bedroom, domesticated and wrong, and I heard her murmur, and the edge of the blanket shift, and then, "See? Danny, what time is it?" There was a smile in her voice like there always is when I wake her by mistake. The woman on the screen lowered her hand from the wall and put her palm flat on the panel beside the door, the exact place where the alarm points are hidden behind new paint. She tipped her chin again to the camera. You could tell she knew where it was, like a person knows where a mirror hangs in their own house. I told Elena I must have pocket dialed. I told her to go back to sleep. I hung up. I watched the screen in a way that meant I wasn't blinking enough, because my eyes started to burn. She stood there for a long exhale's worth of time, and then she stepped out of frame toward the main crypt as the entry camera adjusted to empty. I flipped to the main view. The woman, Elena, was in the center of the room now, in front of the Azara slab, touching the engraved family name with gloved fingers the way I'd seen tourists trace saints in churches. She moved closer to the side chapel where I'd chalked my silly line 2 nights before. It's the habit of the mind to repeat itself. I called anyway. The phone buzzed on our nightstand. A small groggy noise. The shape on the monitor turned her head like a person hearing a name in a crowd. I remember thinking that if I woke Elena properly to show her the screen, and it was her, she would see herself in a place she had never been. That logic does not survive daylight, but it was the only logic my damp heart could conjure at 6 in the morning. I put on jeans over my pajama shorts and didn't brush my teeth. I shoved keys in my pocket like fists and told the living room to keep a close eye on Elena. I jogged the slope, which is hard to do in Granada because every slope is either stair or cobble. The church was gray against a gray sky. The metal gate sweated a little. I didn't hear anything on the other side of the door. The alarm chirped that little friendly bird. The wooden door stuck at the bottom like always, and then let go with a sigh. The room smelled like cold stone and a thin layer of dust with a ribbon of something else I couldn't name in the moment. Not flowers, not incense, not the usual damp. On the camera, the woman had been by the Azara slab. In the room, the dust footprint of the floor told me no one had walked there since my own feet last night. The LEDs hummed and the light bar in the right chapel was indeed on, though the switch by the door should have killed it. I turned it off. The room got flatter. I stood in the center and said out loud, because nobody was there to laugh, "If this is a prank, you win." The room kept being a room. Before I left, I checked the security cabinet. No tamper light. The camera stream still showed the room I was in. That's the paradox that will drive you mad if you let it. The technology telling you something is happening exactly where your eyes insist it is not. I went home and did not tell Elena. I didn't know how to put it in a sentence that didn't sound like the kind of sentence that is meant to end friendships. At noon, we claimed our normal. Don Ernesto muttered at a spreadsheet. Elena polished a paintbrush handle with her thumb, which I learned means she is thinking about matching a color nobody has names for. Mateo brought empanadillas. I mentioned, in the way a person sniffs a subject, that the right chapel lights had been on. Rosa swore she'd turned everything off at her shift change walkthrough. Elena asked me to bring a portable lamp tonight because she wanted to check fine cracks. No one saw a woman in a veil. If she came, she waited for dark. That night, I stayed close to the cameras as if proximity changes how images behave. I walked the rooms with my phone open to the app, like a reflection you can carry. The mains were fine. The entry camera had a little flicker, nothing I hadn't seen at a different site during a different summer when moths jumped at light like drunks at music. I texted Mateo a joke. "If you dream in black and white, do you wake up with dust on your tongue?" And he sent me back a photo of a baby foot in jam. It anchored me to the softness of things. I did my last round at 2 and locked the doors and put the alarm to bed. I made it down to the street and half the slope home before I looked at the cameras again. I regret the order of that sentence. I wish I had looked while I was still inside and felt brave enough to be a liar to myself. She was back. Entry cam first, the same posture, the same gloved brush of wall. The veil caught a thin line of static like a spider thread of light. Main cam next. She moved toward the Azara slab, but slower, like people are in churches when they are alone. She traced the edges, not of letters, but of the faint oval where a portrait used to hang. Elena had told me once these were common in that era. Little oval photographs or enamel pictures of the patriarch, the baby, the one who died too soon. I'd nodded like I see such ovals every day. The oval was empty now. The woman smoothed her palm against the cleaned stone. She turned toward the right chapel. She paused in front of the corner where I'd made my chalk line days ago. It no longer mattered whether anyone had wiped it. She set her hand to the corner like a person leaning into a secret. And then, not looking at the camera, she spoke. You can't really hear audio on those, not the way ours are configured. But you can hear enough to tell the difference between a person talking and a person blowing out a breath. Her mouth moved in a way I know. Elena has a tiny habit of chewing first syllables like fruit. That motion was on the screen. The body language was different, straighter, shoulders held like someone in a photograph for a family who wants to show the world their capacity for grief. But the mouth was Elena's. She lifted her hand from the corner and did something that shouldn't matter and matters. She wiped her glove against the palm of the other hand like dust was a taste you can spit. Elena does that after folding laundry. You don't notice a thing like that until it's in a place it should not be. I didn't call my wife. I called Mateo. He answered on the third ring because he's terrible at sleeping. "Dude," he said, more question than word. "Look at the app," I said, not bothering to pretend there was time for prefaces. "Main cam," he fumbled. The minutes stretched. "I see the room," he said, sleepy suspicion, and then, "Wait, okay, is this a person?" "That's a person." "Is Rosa messing with you?" It was a relief to have another human voice name the outline for what it was. "The face," I said. "The face looks like..." I couldn't get the name out because saying it would betray things to the world I wasn't ready to offer. "Like who?" he asked. "Like Elena," I said. Silence, then. "You want me to come up?" "No," I said too quickly because even then some part of me recognized the wrongness as ours, not general. "Just watch for a second." On the screen, the woman moved into the right chapel. The light bar flicked on without her touching the switch. She put both hands on the wall where the plaster meets a stone course midway up. Like a person searching for a loose brick, she pressed her ear against it. If you've ever watched your wife listen for the kettle's breath, you know the softness of that gesture. Her veil slid a little along her hair. She stepped back, looked up, toward me, toward the camera, toward any eye, and the veil shadowed her eyes like curtains drawn at noon. She lifted her gloved hand and touched 2 fingers to the place where my chalk had been. Then she pointed down. Not a large gesture, not dramatic. A simple downward point, the way my grandmother used to point to a stain on a table and say, "Clean that." I set out without deciding to. Half running, half slipping on the cobbles, cursing my choice of shoes. The gate was cold to my hands. The alarm made its complaining noise until I hushed it with the code. The door stuck, let go, the sigh again. I don't know what I expected. A body where there was no body. A sound like the radio catching breath. The room was a room. But there was that ribbon of smell, faint now but there, violets. Not the flower in a vase smell. Those will turn to water and rot after a day. But the old solid perfume my aunt used to keep in a tin. A chalky violet that makes your tongue tingle. Alina had mentioned something like that once. How some widows in the late 1800s favored violet water. I told myself I was remembering her mention because I wanted it. The right chapel is a narrow slot of a thing. Barely enough space for a little table and a kneeler. I crouched where she had pointed. I pressed the heel of my hand into the plaster seam like an idiot trying to make old walls confess. I closed my eyes, not for spiritual reasons, just because sometimes when you close your eyes, your ears admit things they won't with the world staring. The LEDs hummed. The city exhaled outside, distant and patient. And under that, at the edge of embarrassment, I heard something like a small tap. Not clear. Not a pattern. A suggestion of a suggestion. I leaned in until my cheek touched stone cool enough to make my teeth ache. The tap came again, very faint, as if something inside the wall was slightly settling. No, not settling, answering. I knocked with a knuckle. "Who's there?" Is a dramatic line you say in movies. In real life, what you whisper is, "Tell me why." The wall was quiet. But after a minute that proved I'm capable of a minute. I saw what I hadn't because I wasn't looking. At the base of the wall, where the plaster meets the edge of the floor, there was a hairline crack I didn't recognize. Not a disaster crack. A little seam like a hatch you wouldn't notice unless you were a person with a chalk habit and an anxiety problem. I slid my fingernail into it and felt a soft give. I didn't rip. I didn't pry. I wrote the find in my notebook in my shaky capital letters. Find Fisher S.E. Chapel Base. Possible void behind. In the morning, I would tell Alina and Don Ernesto, and we would do this the legal way, the clean way. That was the adult thing. I put my hand flat on the wall like I'd seen her do. I told the wall in a voice that felt borrowed. I saw you. The room held its breath like rooms do when a truck rumbles 3 streets away and everyone thinks it's thunder. Then I did the lockings in reverse and walked home with the violet smell stuck to the inside of my mouth like a thought. Elena was awake at the small table with a mug she held in both hands like a secret. She was in her robe. Her hair was tied up in one of my shoelaces because hair ties escape to better lives. She looked at me like people look at people they know, down to the way they put their phone on the table. "You're pale," she said. "Lime dust," I said. "I'm okay." She watched me tie my shoes into corners by mistake and then asked slowly, careful with the grammar of delicacy, "Are you angry?" "Why would I be angry?" I smiled too much teeth. She set the mug down and reached for my hand. She does this when she wants me to sit down. "You've been thinking a lot," she said. "You talk in your sleep when you think a lot." I asked because honesty has to sneak in somewhere when what did I say? She took a breath. "You said a name, Azara. We have never met anyone named Azara. We don't know any Azaras." The name lived in my mouth like a coin. "It's on a wall," I said. And then we were both laughing because how else are you supposed to process something like that at 7:30 in the morning? I told her a piece, the piece that is safe to tell, that the cameras glitched, that a woman in period clothes had wandered into the feed, that the tech probably needed a reset. I did not say your face. There are things you cannot ungive to people you love. The morning crew took it seriously because anything on a site that involves the word void makes supervisors see forms. We called the Heritage Council. Alina came with a soft mallet and tapped along the base. The sound changed at the place I'd pointed. Hollow, then not, then hollow again like a cavity behind a tooth. The council sent a man with a clipboard who wears sunglasses even inside. He talked to Alina about micro-drilling and fiber optic scopes like we were about to look at a lung. They picked a point 2 centimeters above the floor to test. The drill sang. The dust was fine and creamy. The scope went in like a small snake. The screen showed, this is the unrecoverable, boring reality, a little pocket, maybe a lost ventilation channel, maybe an old mouse nest turned to powder. But at the very bottom where the scope touched, something flashed pale. "Bone," the council man said, trying to sound neutral. Alina said very low, "Phalanx." Don Ernesto put his scarf on even though the room was already cold. Forms need forms. They suspended work in that chapel and called the archivist. "You found a hidden ossuary," the man in sunglasses said, this time with a smile the way people smile when history makes their email interesting. That afternoon, I took a walk through the Archivo Municipal. The archivist on duty was an old man with a waterfall of hair that made me want to brush my own. I asked if there were records of the Azara family. He tilted his head. "Which one?" he said, as if families multiply like mold. 19th century. That mausoleum, I said, drawing with my finger even though adults do not draw with fingers on paper in other adults' offices. He peered at his monitor and then came back with an index card that looked much older than the monitor. "Azara y Rico de Rivera," he read. "Merchants. 2 sons, 1 daughter, wife died young. Daughter married a Solis, lots of moving between Granada and Cadiz." He pronounced Cadiz like it had a secret inside it. "Daughter's name?" I asked. Not because names matter, but because they feel like handles on a door that won't open. He found it and tapped the card politely. "Elena," he said. "A common name, a dozen Elenas in any cemetery." I did not tell him my wife's name because names once told go looking for each other. The next nights blurred. The woman appeared again on the camera the night after the drill, then not for 2 nights, then again. Each time the same black dress, the same exact tilt of head as if carved. Each time she moved toward the right chapel and placed her gloved hand on the place where the fissure had been bored. She would look up at the camera and hold my gaze as if there was no glass and no app and no time. I started to notice other little things that were not the woman, and yet were more her than she was. The way the room felt slightly colder when the church bells went through their 3 names at dusk, as if dusk had a draft. The radio catching a voice for a second that had no sentence yet. The taste of violets finding its way into my coffee like memory is a spice. Twice I tried to tell Elena without telling her. Twice she kissed my cheek and said there are some places she would prefer to see only in sunshine. I told Mateo everything. The whole stupid story, including the face, because men tell their best friend the things they can't even imagine saying to a priest. He did not laugh. He did not tell me to see a doctor or a magician. If her face is Elena's, he said, then the building used what your head knows as a face. It was a kind answer. Or if she is Elena, he added softly, which was not kind but was fair. We sat on a wall and watched the city come on like a slow constellation. He asked if I'd ever told my wife about the time I slept in my car for a week when we were first dating, because I was afraid to be in anyone's house. I had never told him that. It is not relevant. I was trying to show you how small real life is next to these big old ideas. The official work on the hidden cavity moved slowly as paper. Meanwhile, nights went on. One night around 3, a neighbor's cat squeezed through the gate because cats treat any boundary as a suggestion. I heard it and my body grabbed reflexively for a broom, the universal tool for reassigning cats. And I chased it around the main crypt with enough clatter to wake anyone whose bones were listening. It darted straight for the right chapel and stopped dead at the threshold, the way animals do when something meets their nose and slaps the curiosity out of them. It puffed, flattened, walked backward in a ridiculous moonwalk, then tore away. I told myself cats are dramatic. I went to the door, looked out into the night that is only honest at 4, and I smelled violets again, heavy as if someone had just opened a tin. I followed the smell nowhere like a fool. You want a climax. So do I. Here it is, though it will not feel that way. It was a Saturday. Elena and I had argued about nothing, the way people do when the thing underneath has no words. She said she felt like I was half a second away from me, which is something only someone who loves you will say without rolling their eyes. I said I wasn't sleeping well. We did the adult thing and called a friend for a beer to make the air in our flat change. Our friend, Lucia, lives 2 streets over and knows when not to ask what the fight is about. We sat in the bar that smells like frying oil and old football and pretended to talk about a show. My phone buzzed. I looked without meaning to look. The app had pushed a notification. Motion detected in main crypt. It does that sometimes when a moth blunders into godhood. I tapped. The screen showed the woman, center of the room, back to the camera this time. You could see the line of her shoulders like a horizon. She lifted her hands to the veil and pulled it up and back and set it on the slab with a care that is human and not. Her hair was my wife's hair, the way it looks when she has slept on it and combed it with her fingers. People laughed around us. A bottle cap clicked past my shoe. Lucia said something about the actor on the show. Elena sipped her beer. The woman on the screen turned halfway, and I saw my wife's face turned into a 19th century portrait. Not aged, not dead, just arranged. And then I did the unkind thing. I stood up so fast I scraped the chair and said something about an alarm and left the way cowards leave. I ran. The slope was there like always.
The alarm chirped like always and let me in.
The room was a room. The camera on my phone still held the image it had frozen when I closed the bar app. Veil on slab, hair out. The air smelled like violets and old books, and under that like the inside of a drawer you haven't opened in years. I said, "Elena," out loud. Because what else do you say to a face you love when it is not on the head where it belongs? The room did not answer. I took a step toward the slab. Something shifted in the left chapel. Something so small I would call it a mouse if the cat hadn't fled earlier. I turned toward the sound and saw for a fraction of the kind of second that makes you believe in all the wrong seconds. A reflection in the glass covering a framed prayer. Not my face. Not a stranger. Elena in the black veil. Not in the room, but perfectly in the glass, looking at me from another angle as if the glass had become a room where she was, and we were the ones behind glass. She lifted her hand and pressed 2 fingers to the glass on her side. It smudged like breath. I lifted my 2 fingers and put them against mine. The glass had the temperature of the room. When I breathed, the glass fogged and the smudge she had left blended with it until there was nothing but the squeak of my own prints when I moved them. I stood there until the bells counted a number I couldn't translate to hours. When I finally went home, Elena was at the window, arms crossed, a posture that means she has been around me long enough to know when to let worry be bigger than anger. I told her more. Not everything, not the glass, but the veil on the slab, the pointing, the smell. She listened like she was in a class that doesn't give grades but gives bruises. She said she would come with me in daylight. We went the next afternoon when the sun made dust a kind of theater. She did not smell anything but stone. She listened at the wall and heard nothing. She stood in the center of the room and said, "I don't like it." She pointed at the Azara name and said, "We will finish your job and then you will work at the school like you said you might." It sounded like a promise and a threat and a prayer. On the way out, Rosa asked her if she was from Granada, because I forget that my wife's features write stories in other people's eyes. "My grandmother came from Cadiz," she said without thinking. Rosa smiled like names are coins that buy you small kindnesses. We went home and ate lentils and watched a show where nothing happens and everyone is careful with knives. A week later, Alina showed me a page from a book she'd found in a library that smelled like lemon oil. It had a photograph of the Azara family grave from 1892. The oval portrait was there, a woman with a veil to her chin staring like the photographer had asked her to think of her mother's hands. The caption said, "Elena Azara, fallecida a los 27, and went on with a family history that the councilman would care about more than I ever will. I stared at the face. It was not my wife's, not exactly. The mouth was a little tighter. The mole was further from the eye. The ear had no notch, but the shadow of the line of the jaw was something I have traced with my own hand 1,000 times, while the rest of the world thinks of us as sleeping. Work ended. We sealed the little cavity after documentation, because not everything we find wants to be found. The right chapel was restored, and if you stand there at the right time of day, you can see where the plaster is younger, the way you can tell when someone has filled a tooth if you're the person who kisses that mouth. Don Ernesto did his accounting. Alina packed her brushes into a case that closes like a piano. The councilman found another job with more press. The cameras remained. I removed the app from my phone at Elena's request, the way you remove a splinter that has lodged deeper than your finger wants to admit. I still have the keys on my ring because keys add up, and one day you realize the weight on your belt is a life. Since then, our life is a life. We buy oranges. We argue about the way I leave cabinet doors open. We watch buses crawl up the hill and down like ants carrying the same breadcrumb forever. I avoid violet candies at the checkout. There are nights. This is the part I don't tell Mateo. When I wake because the shape beside me has shifted in a way my body learned to interpret years ago as, "You are not needed for this movement. Go back to sleep." And the room has a slightly different color at the edges, the way rooms do when there is a television on in the next flat. Once, half asleep, I reached to pull the blanket back up on Elena, and my fingers closed on something textured. Not the cotton of our blanket, but something heavier with a small scalloped hem. I sat upright because sitting is the one defense humans have invented. And it was our blanket. Of course it was our blanket. And Elena was breathing that steady married breathing. That means she is far away in some rain she remembers from a school trip. The window was open a crack and the night brought in damp, and for just a second that might have been my own memory trying out a costume. Violets. I tell myself it is not a haunting. I tell myself that old places hold old faces the way basements hold cool air in July. I tell myself that a camera overlay glitched because machines invent reasons to be looked at. I tell myself that a woman named Elena lived and died and has a right to wander her name. I tell myself that the dead borrow whatever face will make us follow them far enough to do what they want. I tell myself, and then I hear. Sometimes when I'm washing dishes and the tap stutters, a small tap in a pattern I'm almost ready to call a pattern. Once, folding laundry, I found violet dust on my hands that turned to nothing when I rubbed them together. I didn't say anything. Elena didn't either. We are both fluent in leaving things where they stand. Last night I walked past the church by accident. Because there are no real accidents in old neighborhoods, only routes you take when your feet know the map better than your head. The gate was closed and the LEDs made a wash of hospital light on stone. I did not have the app, which made the building look like itself again instead of a slow television. I stood there long enough for someone across the street to take out their garbage and for a dog to decide twice where to pee. A bus sighed up the hill. I was about to turn away when I heard the small chirp of the alarm inside, the sound that I know like my own name. And it made me reach for a key that isn't mine anymore. Then just as I was telling myself 100 sensible things, the intercom at the gate made a soft mosquito buzz all on its own. A voice came through, a whisper at the edge of the machine's patience. And it was my wife's voice and not speaking my name the way she does when I forget to turn off a light. The way you call someone back from a room they don't need to enter, to get what is already theirs. I stood there and said nothing, and the night pretended it had nothing to do with any of this. When I went home, Elena was asleep, the blanket up to her shoulder, her face untroubled. On the table by the window, someone had left a small oval of water and a perfect ring where a glass had been. I touched it and my fingers smelled faintly of violets, and when it dried, the smell didn't leave. It is there as I write this. I would scrub my hands if I thought clean is what the living are being asked for. I don't usually post on here, and if this gets buried, I won't be offended. I've tried to tell this to a couple of friends back home, but it all sounds thin and strange when I say it out loud. Writing it down feels more honest somehow, like laying out a map you can point to and say, look, the turn was here. I'm not trying to convince anyone. I just need this off my chest before the winter gets closer again and the mornings go blue and brittle, and I start hearing the same sound in the pipes. I moved to Uppsala last October for a temporary contract in the manuscript reading room at Carolina Rediviva, the big university library with the pale facade that looks like it should smell of chalk and old paper. It was only 6 months, archivist assistant, the kind of thing you do if you love the quiet hiss of plastic gloves and the steady scratch of a pencil. I'd never lived that far north before. My cousin Elin grew up outside Gävle and told me I'd get used to the darkness. You'll love it, she said on a video call while stirring something on the stove. Fika every afternoon, candles everywhere, it's very cozy. She taught me the word lagom the same night, the Swedish comfort with just enough. I repeated it without thinking, and it would come back later like a joke told early in a movie. The flat I rented was technically a basement apartment in a yellow wooden house near Gamla Uppsala, the old mounds and church just north of the city. The landlord, a widow named Stina with a soft voice and a cardigan that always smelled faintly of cardamom, lived upstairs. My door opened directly onto a little gravel path and a small patch of yard with a birch. From my tiny window you could see the white church spire if you leaned just right, and on clear days the mounds looked like sleeping animals under frost. Stina told me that when the wind came down from the fields, you could hear the E4 highway like the sea. I didn't mind that. The sound reminded me there was a world. I biked to work on a used 3-speed with studded tires Stina's nephew sold me cheap. In the mornings, I'd join the stream of cyclists along the river, our lights bobbing, our breath making ghosts. Uppsala mornings in November have a particular color, a kind of diluted watercolor blue that sits in the sky like someone hasn't quite finished painting yet. The ground holds onto frost well into noon. That first week I fell in love with the way the city woke up. Baristas in wool hats wiping foggy glass. A dog shaking out its coat beside a lamppost. Someone carrying a tray of lucicatter shaped like little sleeping cats. It felt like a quiet people moving in rhythm with each other. I didn't find the grave by romantic wandering, not exactly. On my second Saturday, I went with Elon's friend Johan to the churchyard at Gamla Uppsala because he was a photography nerd and wanted to shoot the mounds in blue hour. He'd done his master's at SLU and stuck around. He had that soft, kind face that made you trust him on sight. "There's a spot," he said, breath puffing in little steam puffs. "Near the far stones. You can catch the first sliver of sun right along the line." He spoke English for my sake and switched to Swedish to say hi to the parish caretaker, an older man in a neon vest repairing a fence. The caretaker nodded without smiling and said, "Morgan back. More air than word." We walked among the gravestones with their little red glass candle domes, the brand new candles bright against old stone. I liked how cared for everything seemed. Even the older stones had small tucks of moss brushed neat, dead leaves swept away. People had put copper hearts, small wreaths, cut sprigs of pine tied with ribbon. The church bells didn't ring. There was only the tick of our boots and the dry rattle of bracken in the wind. The air smelled like iron. "That's the angle," Johan said after taking a few shots, pointing toward a corner where the stones thinned and the ground sloped. I followed the direction and saw it then, and the words didn't mean much yet, so I just stood and stared. There was a grave that faced the wrong way. It wasn't obvious at first. The stones were simple and Swedish, granite slabs and small crosses, names with clean carved lines and dates that mostly began with 19-something. But your brain keeps a quiet compass, and when you look at a line of east-facing headstones designed to greet the rising sun, you expect your shadow to fall a certain way. This one cut against that, a rectangle of earth edged with low stone, with a single old headstone that sat like a folded knee, twisted a few degrees west. It had no family name. There was only a first name in older script that the lichen had almost erased, and below that a long dash and then nothing. No year of birth, no year of death. The stone faced into the last of the night, the wrong direction for the hope of morning. Someone had scraped the plot clean of leaves very recently, and set a single white candle at the foot, unlit but new. On either side the earth was dark with water and it looked like something had knelt there. "People do that sometimes," Johan murmured, as if I'd said anything. "Old superstitions. Or sometimes they just cut corners." He raised the camera, then lowered it. He didn't take a picture. "Let's go up to the mound." As we walked away, the church's weathercock creaked somewhere and the old caretaker fell into step on the path ahead of us, one hand on a canvas bag that rattled with tools. He didn't look at us, but when he passed, he paused just long enough to lay his other hand on that wrong-facing headstone. The touch was gentle and purposeful, like you might greet the shoulder of a friend after not seeing them for a long time. I forgot about it until the following Thursday, which was the day the pipes began to hum. Basement flats have a personality, and mine had been kind so far. Warm enough with a radiator that clicked inside in predictable patterns, and a tiny hallway where boots went to die. That night I woke a few minutes before my phone alarm. The kind of waking where you're not quite up but your mind clicks to you quietly in the dark. At first I thought it was a truck passing. The room had that soft shake to it, a frequency you feel in your teeth more than hear. It wasn't a truck. I realized that when the sound moved through the building like a line. The hum began by my bathroom, lifted along the corridor so the glasses in the cabinet made little shy chimes, crossed the kitchen where the cutlery in the drawer vibrated once, touched the window where the birch outside laced shadow on the glass, and then faded toward the stairwell. It took maybe 4 seconds and then it was gone. I lay there with my hands flat on my chest and my tongue pushed against the roof of my mouth like a child, waiting for the second wave. It didn't come. When I checked my phone, it said 7:43. brushed my teeth by the small halogen over the sink, and told myself it was the heating system. Stina knocked on my door, later that morning with a bag of Cannelbuller and a worry line in her forehead. "For lot," she said, then switched to English. "I forgot to warn you. The pipes, sometimes they sing it's old. They used to say you could tell the time from them." She laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You slept okay?" I told her I had, because the way she watched my face made me want to keep it light. She patted my arm. "You will get used." The hum came again the next day, only earlier, and this time I did what I always do when I can't name a sound. I stood very still and tried to point to where it started. I closed my eyes in the bathroom and waited. A pressure, then a vibration at the tile. It ran beneath me like a rope being pulled hard under the floor, straight through the middle of the flat toward the outside door. I opened the door in time to feel the air move cool against my face. By the time I'd stepped into my boots, the yard was still again. The birches' twigs black against the late morning sky. The gravel path looked exactly how it always did. I told Elin about the hum that night on the phone, and she sounded amused. "Oh, the singing pipes," she said. "Every Swedish basement has a haunted pipe. Welcome." When I described the newest part, the movement like a line, she went quiet. "It's an old place," she said carefully. "You're near the church. The ground there is layered. Don't go walking around at dawn. People drive fast. It's still dark." "I bike," I said. "I see better in the dark than the drivers." "Don't," she said, and it was the first time her voice lost the bright tone she used to keep me, the foreign cousin above water. "Don't be outside before sunrise." The next morning I woke again just before my alarm, the hum starting to thread the flat. This time I was already in the hallway when it touched the shelf where I kept my keys. The key ring buzzed and skittered so sharply that one of the keys jumped toward the edge. It would have fallen if I hadn't cut my hand trying to catch it. The cut was small and the kind that stings more from surprise, but the smear of blood left a thin line on the white shelf. I stood there like a fool with my finger between my lips, thinking, I know where the line goes. I put on my coat, hat, gloves, tucked a candle and a lighter in my pocket for reasons that felt polite rather than logical, and stepped into the yard. The sky had that pre-dawn bruise to it. In the east, a smudge of light made the edges of the birch look like lace. It was below freezing, that dry cold that squeaks under boots. My breath hung ahead of me like a guide. The hum brushed my legs, low and insistent, like a dog weaving between your knees on its way out the door. I followed. The gravel path ran to the street, then a narrow sidewalk to the little lane that led to the church. The caretakers sometimes put sand on the slick bits, and the sand had been scattered last night. My boots crunched on it. The hum moved along beside me, not constant but pulsing. A pulse that matched the blue of the sky thinning. There was enough light now to see the snow-bent grasses at the field edges, a line of jackdaws like notes on a wire, and beyond the mounds, the blunt white of the church bellying up out of the ground. If anyone had been out walking their dog or starting their car, if a bus had rattled by, if I had seen even a single other human in a reflective vest, I think I would have turned back. But the world had that empty look, like it was caught with its eyes closed, and in that emptiness the hum felt like direction rather than warning. The churchyard gate squeaked the way it always does. I stepped through and immediately felt the temperature drop a degree, a tiny, precise notch. The hum went quiet. I stood with my hands tucked under my armpits, suddenly aware I had not told anyone what I was doing. The stones were sugar white with frost, each letter packed with it. The candle domes on the graves were muted gems. I found myself walking the same way Johan and I had walked, though it had been his idea then. Light seeped into the world from the right, east, and the stones received it like faces tilting toward a story. The wrong-facing grave was darker than the others. Not by color, the stone was still only stone, but somehow it held the shadow a second longer. The earth of the plot was not iced, though everything around it was. My breath clouded and then drifted. I stood there with the ridiculous lighter in my hand and the candle in my pocket, and felt like I'd arrived late to a conversation. Then a shadow. Long, deliberate, exactly as if a person were standing just out of frame to my left, slid across the nearest frost-covered stones and reached toward the wrong-facing grave. There was no one there to cast it. It came from the direction of the path and stretched over the stones in a shape that would have been a person, if you could only catch them head-on. It had a shoulder shape, a suggestion of a head, an arm that reached as if for balance. The shadow didn't wobble or blur the way a cloud shadow does. It held its line, sharp edge, and as the earliest edge of the sun limned the stones, the shadow did what shadows do. It lengthened. It passed over the grave like the hand of a clock completing an hour. When it touched the wrong-facing headstone, I heard the hum again under my soles, and both of my hands went numb to the wrists. Not the way they go numb when you forget your gloves. This was inside numb, a hollowing, as if my bones were briefly gone. I had the thought, so clear it almost felt inserted, that this shadow had crossed here each morning, always just before the sunrise, and that the grave faced the wrong direction not because someone didn't know which way was east, but because it had always been waiting for something coming from the other side. My phone vibration startled me out of whatever happened next. It was Johann. He was an early riser, and perhaps he had seen my dot moving on the location share we'd set up after a night out. "You're at the church?" he said without hello. "Don't go there before sunrise." "I'm here now." He swore softly in Swedish and told me to wait. "Don't touch anything," he added like I was a child. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. I hung up and realized I had taken the candle out of my pocket without remembering doing it. I set it down at the foot of the wrong-facing stone, the same place where the new white candle had been on Saturday. Only now there was no candle. Someone had taken it, or something. That thought landed and felt silly, so I let it sit and leaned against the boundary stone to work my hands back to life. A voice behind me said, "You shouldn't be here alone." I turned too fast and the world tilted a little. The caretaker in the neon vest stood at the path's bend, his bag over his shoulder. He looked exactly as he had looked Saturday. He had that same way of not quite meeting your eye. He came closer, stepping carefully to avoid the stones, and stopped beside me with the square-footed balance of a person who spends their life outdoors. He held his glove lightly in one hand. The skin of that hand was thick and pale, the glove itself patchy with dark damp. "I couldn't sleep," I said, and immediately regretted how young that sounded. I followed. I trailed off, and he waited without rescuing me. When he spoke, it was in Swedish, and when I squinted, he switched to the slow, careful English of someone doing a favor. "Some graves face the wrong way," he said. "It happens." He shifted the bag to the other shoulder and looked past me, not directly at the stone, but at a point just to the right of it. It wasn't a word, just a sound, an evaluation. "People tend them anyway." "Who?" I asked. "There's no name. There's no dates. No record," he agreed. "Some records were taken away. Long ago, we make a note. It balances." He made a small slicing gesture in the air, thumb across palm. "But when the notes go, the ground still remembers." He nodded toward the strip of uniced earth and the unmistakable marks of knees or hands pressed there recently. "Someone comes." "Who?" He didn't answer. He simply looked down at my hands as if noticing them for the first time, and then at the candle beside the stone. "Not that one," he said, not unkindly. "Not today." Johann arrived out of breath and red-cheeked enough I could smell the cold on him. He greeted the caretaker with a little bow of the head. They exchanged a few quick Swedish sentences that I couldn't follow. When Johann turned to me, he had the careful face people put on when they're not sure if you're going to cry. He stopped as if he'd nearly used the caretaker's name and then thought better of it. "He suggests we come back after church is open," he said. "We can ask someone inside." He says sometimes the parish keeps old books not in the main records. The caretaker had already moved up the path. After a few steps, he paused and laid his hand on the wrong-facing stone again. Gloved this time, fingers spread. The gesture was the same as before, respectful, personal. My chest tightened with the knowledge that this was not a man who would indulge nonsense. He walked away without looking back. We came back that afternoon when the sky was a quieter kind of gray and the bells marked noon. The parish office smelled like coffee and paper and winter coats drying. A woman in a wool dress named Karen listened to our halting description, leaving out the part about me following a sound and an invisible shadow crossing the frost, and nodded with a furrowed brow. She pulled 3 books out from a cupboard. The newest had typed labels. The oldest was handwritten in careful ink with a spine that made my gloved hands gentle by instinct. "There are some plots that are special," she said, choosing the word. "Old Uppsala is older than what we see. Sometimes things move, and sometimes the records move differently. We try to keep the stories when we can because the ground should not be left alone." She ran a finger down a page without touching it, just following the line with air. "Here." There was a note of a west-facing grave in the 19th century. It says, "Turned for cause." She looked up, saw our faces, smiled with her mouth but not her eyes. "It's a phrase. For suicides, for executed, for people, not Christian." She said it without judgment and with a sadness that told me she had said it before in other winters to other curious people. "It's tended," I said. "They often are," she said, "especially before All Saints and in winter. People remember their dead when it is dark. There used to be something called the long shadow told to children around here. In the blue mornings there is a last visitor, but you know how stories are. They like places like this." On the way out, Johann wore the posture of a man carrying something careful and invisible. "We should leave it," he said. "Just let it be. This is the sort of thing that doesn't like to be looked at." I told him I would. I meant it. Sometimes meaning it does nothing. The next week the hum woke me earlier. 7:29, 7:16. A day came when it stirred me at 6:58, then 6:52, and that was when the sky was still entirely dark and the cold had teeth. I learned the sound of it. I learned that when my keyring rattled, I had exactly the time it took to pull on boots and a hat, before the air outside registered in the hollows of my cheeks like a physical thing. I didn't always go out. Some mornings I stood at the door and let it pass like letting a cat out. Something domestic. Other mornings I went. I started buying candles from the ICA and kept 2 in my coat. Sometimes there would be no candle at the wrong-facing grave. Sometimes there would be one burned down to a skin of wax. Once there were 3, and the third had been pressed down so hard into the earth. It had left a perfect round mark in the still soft soil, as if whoever said it needed to feel their own weight. Johann stopped answering my texts when I told him I was still going, not angrily, just with a silence that had a contour to it like a hand held up. Elin called twice a week, and the first thing she always asked was what time I was sleeping. I lied twice and told the truth once, and that last time she got quiet and told me a story about when she was small. How her grandmother had said there are days in northern winters when the border between night and morning doesn't quite set, and things that belong in gaps slip loose. "We don't look at them," she said softly. "We leave a light and say a name and go home." "Whose name?" I asked. "Any name you loved," she said. "Whatever you have." On the first Sunday of Advent, Stina left a basket by my basement door with a small Advent star and a jar candle and a card in thick, careful handwriting. It said, "For the windows, for the mornings." The ribbon was white silk and the knot as neat as handwriting. I hung the star in my small window, and the glow made the room feel like it was holding its breath in a good way. That night I slept 10 hours without waking. The next morning I woke later than the hum and felt relief and then a mean, sharp absence, like hunger. I checked my phone and saw I had a missed call from a number I didn't recognize and a message from Johann that was only a picture. The churchyard, taken from the path. The wrong-facing grave in the lower left. A long shadow across the stones, sharp as an insult. Behind it, faint but undeniable, 2 sets of footprints leading to the plot and then away toward the trees, as if whoever tended the grave didn't use the path the rest of us did. The picture was time-stamped 7:41. I called him, and he picked up on the 3rd ring with wind in the phone like he'd stepped outside to talk. "You don't have to go, you know," he said without hello. "It will still be there." "I know," I said. "I don't know why The hum shivered through my doorway. It was 7:39, it felt later. The star in my window flickered as if someone had run a finger along the wire inside. "Don't go," he said at the same time I said. "I'll just look." We both laughed a little because there was no humor anywhere in it. "I'll meet you," he added and hung up. I told myself I would stand at the gate and that would be enough. I promised myself out loud like a child bargaining in bed. The morning had that clarity that comes when the cold is dry and the sky empty. The hum ran along the ground in a straight line, and when I reached the gate I stopped, like I'd said I would, and put my hands in my pockets to keep my resolve from seeping out through my fingertips. The shadow crossed the stones exactly as before, only this time there was another. The first shadow slid along, long arms stretched, a single being moving toward the wrong-facing grave. The second one lagged behind it by a heartbeat. A little shorter, a little narrower in the shoulders, like a smaller, younger version matching steps. They didn't overlap. They moved as 2, and as the sun's rim lifted a hair's breadth higher, both shadows lengthened faster. Behind me on the path there was the sound of someone walking quickly on gravel, and the heavy exhale of a person who hates to be late. Johann came around the hedge with his hat pushed back and his face raw with cold. He took one look at the stones, then at me, and without speaking, he reached out and grabbed my sleeve. He never touched people. He pulled once, hard, the way you pull someone off a step they haven't seen. "We're leaving," he said, and his voice was the kind that makes children obey. We didn't. We watched. The first shadow reached the wrong-facing stone and stilled. Arm extended like each morning it arrived at the same exact spot. The second shadow caught up and placed its narrower shape along the first, overlapping it by a fraction, so the two became one darker line for a single beat, one of those tiny moments your heart puts away and recognizes later when you're in a stairwell or a grocery store and you don't know why. You're suddenly cold, and then the combined shadow moved forward past the stone into the thin clearing beyond the graves where the ground dips toward the field. No person cast either of them. The field was empty, the trees still. The shadows didn't break or scatter. They simply crossed as if completing something they had started at a time before the fence, before the church. In that moment, with the warm grip of Johann's fingers through my coat and the taste of metal in my mouth, and the hum under the ground matching my pulse, I had the full and absurd impression of a parent and child walking, the smaller shape catching up to the longer slowing without seeming to, the way people do when they know exactly how many steps are left. It came with a wordless apology that wasn't mine, and I swallowed it because if I said it out loud it would sound like I was making it large on purpose. The caretaker stood at the top of the path. I hadn't heard him arrive. He was not wearing his neon vest this time, only a heavy sweater and a hat pulled low. He held nothing, no bag, no tools. He lifted one hand, not to us, but to the wrong-facing stone. The gesture was a farewell, but not to anyone who could turn and wave. Johann's fingers on my sleeve loosened. He was crying without sound. I could feel the trembling through the fabric of my coat. We left a minute later. We didn't speak on the path or at the gate or in the lane. At the corner by my house, Johann made the lowercase decision you make when you don't want to test a bigger one and said, "Coffee?" I nodded like I had just remembered that was a word. We sat in the small kitchen while the mocha pot made that comforting angry sound, and the star in my window shone paler now that the day had fully arrived. He wrapped his hands around the mug and didn't drink. "I'm not religious," he said finally, "but there are things I won't photograph." He wiped his eyes with the heel of his palm, embarrassed. "My sister," he added, and then stopped. He didn't need to finish. I remembered the 2 sets of footprints in his picture. I let my hand sit on the table like I might reach if he asked me to. He didn't. After that morning, the hum didn't wake me for 3 days. The pipes clicked, the radiator sighed, but the line that moved like a guide rope didn't pull taut. I slept and woke like a person who had made a bargain and had it upheld. Stina left oranges on my stairs. The caretaker nodded when our eyes met in the churchyard on my way past. A recognition like the kind you give to someone who sat near you on a plane once, and then shared a taxi. I worked in the reading room and the onion skin pages whispered nicely under my hand. Winter lay frankly on the town, and it was good. It might have stayed that way if I hadn't made the small, stupid change of moving my morning run 10 minutes earlier for a week when my schedule shifted. The city was still asleep when I loped along the river path with the other headlamp ghosts. On the 4th day, I turned at the bridge and my breath fogs built a rhythm that felt like a metronome. I was far from Gamla Uppsala. I wasn't thinking about graves. I was thinking about the soft complaint my left knee had been making. The sky in the east had only the suggestion of light to it, and the river was a quiet, moving slate. The hum touched my feet. It wasn't the same as at the house. No neat line from bathroom to door. It came up through the path as if the ground under all of Uppsala were one thing and it had stirred a little. It moved from my left foot to my right foot, and then up my shins and knee, and it didn't feel like a machine at all. It felt this time like the brush of a coat passing you in a doorway when you're both trying to be polite, and neither of you quite are. It felt like someone late and sorry. My headlamp flickered. I stopped dead. My breath drew in and stayed in my chest until it hurt. The hum was gone. The river made the sound of a jacket sleeve on a sofa, polite. A biker bell dinged somewhere and a dog barked 3 times and was silent. The sky in the east brightened a shade you wouldn't take off a paint chip. I walked home instead of running. I looked at my hands on the keys as I opened the door, and I knew with the small, sure knowledge that makes you shameful how much I had wanted the bargain to hold without my keeping my part. In the hallway, the radiator hissed like it was laughing. In the kitchen, the Advent star burned steady and honest and then winked once, twice, like it was practicing being a little night sky of its own. Nothing else happened that day. Or the next. On the third morning, a Tuesday, my phone woke me at 7:20 with a message from Karen at the parish office. It said, "If you are free this week, the archivist has found a note in a box in the attic. It may interest you." The message felt innocent and completely inevitable. I replied that I could come at 10 on Thursday and put the phone face down, and I forgot it, like you forget a dream when a bus door opens and cold air touches your face. I made coffee. I cut a slice of bread and toasted it. When I reached up for the jar of cloudberry jam on the top shelf, the key ring on the hook beside the cupboard rattled once, hard, and settled. I went to the churchyard. I didn't mean to. My body did. The gate squeaked and I stepped through, and I knew, as surely as you know your own room in the dark, that the wrong-facing grave would look exactly as it had always looked to me. The earth a little darker, the frost clinging to everything except where it had no permission, the candle either there or not there with equal significance. I knew these things, and they were true. What was different was this: the headstone had a new mark. At first I thought it was a smear of lichen I had overlooked, but it was a carved line, shallow, recent. The stone still pale around it the way wounds look when the skin is freshly opened. Below the old name, illegible now, someone had carved a small vertical line and then paused. If you had asked me to bet on whether there would be another line tomorrow, I would have put more than I should have on yes. I reached without thinking and touched the fresh-cut stone. It was colder than the air, and the cold ran up my finger like a thread. Behind me, at the path's bend, the caretaker stood with his hands in his pockets. He nodded once, as if I had completed a sentence he had been waiting for. "It balances," he said quietly, and it was the first time his English sounded like a thing he uses in his own head, rather than a tool. "What is that?" I asked, my voice thin in the morning. "What are the lines?" "Sometimes names are long," he said. "Sometimes they are saved for later. The ground knows already." He looked at me then, direct and not unkind, and I had the sudden sensation of being counted. It wasn't sinister. It wasn't even personal. It was practical, the way a person counts chairs before a dinner. He looked away first. "You should go now," he said. "It is almost dawn." When the shadow came this time, it did not move along the stones toward the wrong-facing grave. It began at the wrong-facing grave. It stood up out of it like the way heat stands over asphalt in August. Except there was no shimmer, only the black clarity of something that refuses to be diluted by the world. It stretched toward me and over my boots, and I didn't feel cold or fear in the way I had expected to. I felt the ache you feel when you're early for a train and watch one leave without you. Something in my pocket pressed into my leg, and when I put my hand in, I pulled out the white candle I had been carrying for days. I hadn't known it was still there. I knelt and pressed it into the soil, and the wax went soft instantly in the spot that had never held frost, as if there were still heat somewhere below. At Tenket on Thursday, I sat with Karen and the archivist in a room that smelled softly of dust and fur-lined gloves. We looked at a note in a hand that was older than my language, older than any debate about East or West, that said, in the most practical way possible, a grave was turned for cause and a child with it, and they were not named because the name was not needed for the walking. "They put them together," Karen murmured, tracing the space where a name might have gone. "Turned away from the morning so they would not expect it, and toward the evening so dusk would lead them. They were thought to cast a shadow that lasted longer than a person should." The archivist closed the box and said nothing, I remember. I walked home through a cold so honest it felt like clean pain. At the gate I stopped, not to look, because looking wasn't really the thing now, but to listen. The hum ran along the ground and through the key ring and the thin glass of the Advent star, and the old pipes in Stina's walls, and the bones at my wrist. It wasn't a machine sound anymore, if it ever had been. It was the sound I had heard when two shadows overlapped and became one darker line for a beat, and then continued as if nothing in the world had been more natural. There are other details. A police car one morning idling at the lane with its fog blowing sideways and an officer standing with his hands in his armpits, not doing anything at all except respectfully letting someone pass who had always had right of way. A neighbor woman who never waved, and then one day left a sprig of pine near the wrong-facing stone so precisely at the center, you'd think she used a ruler. A boy on a scooter who stopped at the gate and looked in and looked at me and made the careful face of someone shutting a door quietly, so as not to disturb a sleeping adult. Stina asking if I needed anything from System Boliget, and then not asking twice when I said no. Little things that make a place feel grown in around you. I've been back in my home country for months now. The contract finished in April, when the light in Sweden goes to the other extreme and midnight feels like just a shade of day. Elin jokes that I left the minute the morning stopped frightening me. Johan texts me photos of the river and once, in June, sent a video from the bike bridge where the sky had so much light in it his face looked like a sea creature. I live in a place where dawn and sunset are more ordinary, where graves face east because that's how the cemetery was built. Sometimes when I wake before my alarm, which I do more often than I admit, I lie very still and listen for a sound that is not a sound. I touch the key ring on the little shelf by my front door. Nothing rattles. Sometimes I stand in the kitchen and feel my right hand go numb to the wrist for a second, like a string has been pulled through me. It passes immediately. I tell myself this is just blood and nerves and habits. But in the bottom of a drawer there is a stub of white candle I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I keep it wrapped in a paper towel that smells faintly of cardamom, and when I hold it in my palm I can feel the slight cup my thumb made in the wax. The last morning I pressed it against Swedish soil. The slight cup where the heat came up from underneath instead of down from the flame. If I set it on the shelf beside my keys, it sometimes, just sometimes, leans a fraction toward the wrong direction. I used to think the phrase "facing the wrong way" belonged to somebody else's superstition. Now I think it is just a description like Short Street or Blue Door. That grave in Uppsala faced the way it needed to, and the long shadow at dawn will cross those stones whether or not anyone is there to see it. But someone was there when I was, and someone will be there tomorrow. And if you send this under some rock on the internet, it will be fine, because stories have their own way of lying down where they belong. Last week I woke at 5:12, too early even for winter habits, and the room was so still that it felt like a new house you haven't taught your noises to yet. I lay there listening, and then I heard it. Not under me or behind the walls or along the window, but in the hallway outside my door. It was the smallest version of the hum, the kind you could miss if a truck passed or someone in the building sneezed. It nudged the nails in the coat rack so they made a sound like a tiny bell, and the bell rang once and then again, a beat later, like another hand had found it. I opened my door. The hall was ordinary, the kind of hallway you forget immediately. On the wall opposite, where the morning light from the stairwell makes a low bright rectangle that my neighbor's cat loves, there was a shadow that didn't belong to anything I could see. It was long and moved slowly toward the corner. Ahead of it by half a step was a smaller one. I don't know what it means that they could find me here. I don't know if anything ever followed me, or if I simply learned to see a thing that was already in the world, and once you learn, you can't unlearn. I went back inside and I didn't light the candle and I didn't tell anyone all day. That evening, when I stood by the sink to wash a cup, I saw that someone, me presumably, unless my life is stranger than I think, had traced a thin, shallow line with a key on the inside of the cupboard door where no one could see. Just one line, recently done, clean and pale in the wood. I closed the door gently and told myself there were no more lines to come. But I sleep with the candle on the shelf beside the keys anyway, because lagom never did fit me properly, and because dawn, wherever you are, is a place things know how to find. And sometimes just before the sun comes up, the key ring shivers once and settles, and if I put my hand out in the half-dark, a cold as honest as a hand in winter takes it for a beat and then lets it go. I've put this off for months because the whole thing makes me feel like I'm about to talk myself into a corner. But if I don't write it down, I'm worried I'll start filling the gaps with something that makes it easier to sleep. I work as a gravedigger and groundskeeper in a hillside cemetery above Berchtesgaden, the kind that shows up as a pretty postcard if you're traveling through Bavaria in summer. Red geraniums, painted wooden crosses, neat gravel paths, the Alps standing around like patient old men. It's quiet up there most days. Snow muffles everything in winter. Rain turns the paths dark in spring, and in autumn the larch needles fall like dull gold confetti over the stones. People think a cemetery is nothing but sorrow, but most of it is routine. Trimming hedges, raking gravel, painting iron fences when they start to flake, hauling watering cans to the family plots. The dead behave themselves. It's the living who bring their noise. My name is Matthias. I'm 31. I got the job through my uncle, who covers maintenance for several church properties in the district. He thinks it's honest work, and I agree. I like knowing what the day wants from me. Cut the grass, fix the faucet by the tap, sweep the chapel steps. When tourists climb up to take photos, I keep out of their way and pretend not to hear them trying out their funeral voices. So peaceful, they say, and most of the time it is. There were 3 of us who took care of the place last year. Me, my friend Lucas, and our supervisor, a retired mason named Kohler who'd rebuilt half the headstones after a storm back in the early 2000s. We had a rhythm. We'd meet at 7 by the tool shed, sign the log, divvy up tasks. Lucas would handle the hedges because he liked the clean lines. I'd do the paths or dig if someone had passed and the funeral was scheduled. If we were quick, we'd sit on the low wall near the linden tree and split a semmel and talk about football or complain about the bus schedule. Nothing mysterious about any of it. I'm telling you this because what happened didn't come after a week of ghost stories or sleepless nights. It came in the middle of a stretch of normal days when the biggest excitement was whether the parish would approve a new rain gutter. The cemetery is on a hillside. The paths are terraced, stepping up between sections with little stone stairs shaded by yews. Down by the gate there's a brass plaque with opening hours and rules about candles. Up behind the chapel, tucked into the trees, there's the tool shed. It's older than it looks, just a rectangle of dark wood with a small window and a padlock you have to coax like an old dog. On the left side of the door there's another plaque, this one rusted through at one corner with names of caretakers engraved in neat rows. Nothing fancy, just names and years. The oldest ones are from the 1920s. At the bottom, alone on his own little line, is Josef Eigner, 1931-1954, with the words Erster Platzwart, the original groundskeeper. When I started, I thought that was a nice bit of continuity. Eigner had done the job when the cemetery was still expanding, before the retaining wall, before the path down to the new section. I asked Herr Kohler once if he'd known Eigner, and he snorted. Before my time, he said. They say he kept a ring of keys so heavy it pulled his belt down. Then he made a face that meant the conversation was over. Lucas tried to find a photo, but nobody had one. Just the name on the plaque and a line in an old parish ledger saying he died suddenly in the winter of '54. Natural causes. That's what the note said. People had hard winters then. All of this is background. You could work here for years and never think about the names on that wall again. We kept the place clean. People came, they cried, they left candles, they went home. I know how a story like this sounds online, so I'll keep it simple. It began with a sound. It was the kind of sound that doesn't mean anything until it repeats. You hear a single rattle and think wind in a gutter or a loose tool. You hear it again, and your brain starts to pin it to a shape. It was the last week of October. We'd had that strange warm spell that sometimes slips in before the cold sinks its teeth in. The leaves were holding back a green that looked tired. I was up near the top terrace, raking leaves into piles to bag later. Lucas was down near the chapel, sanding a wooden bench that had gone gray on the slats. There were a few visitors at the lower path. An older woman with a wicker basket of tulips and 2 men standing with their hands in their pockets like they were having the same argument for the 100th time. I was alone on that top level, just me and a shovel I'd propped against a yew. I heard the first jingle as I straightened up. It wasn't the clink you get when a trowel hits a stone or when a wheelbarrow shakes. It was a delicate, careful jingle, like someone testing a ring of keys so they didn't all go at once. I turned in a slow circle, rake in my hands like an old man's staff. There was nobody on my path. The shed door was closed. The trees were still. I told myself the sound came from below, carried up the hill. Sound does that in the cemetery. Echoes go sideways and up. I went back to work. I heard it again. This time it came from my left, near the slope where the stones press into the earth. Jingle, pause, jingle. Not in a rush. Not careless, like someone who has keys that say who they are. I walked along the border stones. Gravel creaked under my boots. I was a meter away from the corner of the path when I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees. He was a small man, stooped, wearing a dark jacket that was buttoned right up under his throat. His cap sat low. His face was the kind that disappears if you don't look straight at it. Thin mouth, flat chin. In both hands, held against his stomach like a precious thing, was a ring of keys so large I don't know how I missed it until I was right there. They were iron keys, the old kind, some long, some fat-bellied. They looked heavy even before he moved them, and they made that polite metal sound again. "Grüß Gott," he said, and his voice was the quiet of someone who doesn't need to shout to be heard. "You must be the new man." I nodded because it seemed easier than correcting him. I'd been there long enough to recognize most of the regulars, and he wasn't one of them. But people come up when they're sad or when they don't want to be seen. He could have been the latter. "Morning," I said. "Can I help you?" He glanced at the rake, then at the path, then at the shed. "The gate by the lower entrance," he said. "It's sticking again. The latch swells in this weather. We used to oil it with lamp oil when the machine oil was too thin." "We can look," I said. "I can put some lithium grease on it." His lips twitched like he'd heard a joke and didn't approve of the punchline. "Lithium," he repeated as if tasting the word. "Yes, things change. Best not to let them change too far." I didn't say anything. There are people who come up with advice like they're dropping off groceries. You let them talk. He took a step closer. Up close I could see that his jacket was old-fashioned, with the buttons sewn on by hand, the thread a little uneven. His boots were polished but scuffed at the toes, the kind my grandfather used to wear. He had a smell that I only recognized later. Iron filings, cold air that's been shut in, and a whiff of tobacco from a time when it didn't come in filters. "You're early," he said, as if reciting a rule. "It's good to be early. The dead don't like surprises." He glanced past me at the path down to the shed again. "I keep a routine. Rounds at 2:30, locks at 1:45, lantern at dusk." He tapped the keys with the back of one knuckle and they answered him. "You work here?" I asked because the question finally demanded itself. "Are you with the parish?" Maybe he was one of those volunteers who sweep the chapel and stock the votive candles. He smiled without showing his teeth. "I'm the Platzwart," he said. "The original. It's my place to keep." He said it like you might say your own name to a child. Matter of fact, patient, as if he'd had to repeat it 1,000 times and would repeat it 1,000 more. I'm slow sometimes, but not stupid. I looked at his keys, at his boots, and then down the slope at the tool shed with the plaque beside the door. "Einer?" I asked. And the name came out before I remembered that the last time anyone wrote it down with purpose was before my father was born. He nodded once, like a teacher acknowledging a correct answer. "Joseph," he said. But we didn't use first names unless it was necessary. He didn't say he'd died. He didn't correct me. He didn't do any of the things a ghost in a story might do to drive the point home. He just stood there with his keys and the certainty of a man at his station. I didn't feel a cold draft or see my breath bloom. My heart thumped a bit because a stranger knows your schedule, but that's a normal fear. I could have left it at that and chalked him up as someone's relative who liked to play pretend. If the next part hadn't happened, I probably would have. Lucas's trimmer started up down the hill, the tinny snarl that all new tools have. The old man tilted his head like a dog hearing a high tone. "We kept the borders neat with shears," he said. "It makes you look. Machines let you look away." He lifted his keys, and for a second I thought he'd offer them to me. And then I realized he was counting them. The ring was crowded but ordered. Long keys to the left, short to the right, fat in the middle. His thumb went over them with the ease of habit. "Do you lock the west gate first?" he asked as if testing me. I opened my mouth. I don't know why I answered him like I would Herr Köhler. "We locked the lower gate first," I said. "Then the west. The police asked us to. People climb in for dares." It came out a little defensive. "I hate being corrected." He nodded slowly. "Police," he said like another new word. "They used to come only when there was a fight at the Wirt's house. Now they come for everything." He looked at me again, not unkindly. "Remember the routine," he said. "It's what separates a place like this from a field by the road." Then he turned and walked along the edge of the trees toward the break in the hedge that leads to the upper path, moving with that careful old man walk where you place each foot knowing exactly how it will feel. I didn't follow him right away. It felt rude. I held the rake like it would tell me what to do. Then I put it down and jogged the few steps to the corner and looked after him. The path toward the upper border was empty. The ewes stood still. A stone angel looked off into the pines. I walked a little way down, thinking maybe he'd stepped behind a grave cross. Nothing, I wasn't scared. Just unsettled in a way that felt like you've left a kettle on. I called down to Lucas and he killed the trimmer and waved at me. I didn't shout back what I wanted to. The older woman would have heard. Instead, I went to the shed. The padlock was the same as I'd left it. The plaque by the door was the same as it had always been. Rusted corner, names going back to 1923, Joseph Eigner, 1931-1954, first groundskeeper. I ran my finger over the letters like they could be warm. They weren't. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The shed smells like damp wood, oil, soil, and the faint sweetness of cut grass. There's a workbench along the left wall with jars of screws and hooks. 2 shelves hold the cans of paint and the linseed oil for the benches. The tools hang in a row with their handles oiled and their outlines sketched in pencil, so you know if something's missing. When I started, I thought that was a bit too neat for Lucas and me. We're careful, but not like that. Herr Köhler had told us the outlines had always been there. He thought a previous caretaker had been a carpenter. I stared at them for a long minute. The hanging shears were in their place. The spare set of keys to the lower and west gates hung on their hooks labeled in my handwriting. For the first time since the man had spoken, I felt stupidly cold. It was a sunny day. Sunlight came through the single window and made a rectangle on the workbench. You could see dust floating in it. I borrowed one of the little oil cans anyway and headed down to the lower gate. Lucas met me halfway, wiping sawdust on his trousers. "You okay?" he asked. "You look like you saw a bear." "There was a man," I said. "Up by the upper path, older, with keys." "Said he was the Platzwart." Lucas grinned. "A ghost story before lunch?" "Nice try, I'm not joking." He knew about the latch on the lower gate. "He said they used lamp oil." Lucas shrugged. "Old guys like to be right about stuff. Maybe he used to work here, or his dad did." He tilted his head toward the chapel where the older woman had lit a candle and was whispering into the air. "Don't spook the visitors." We went to the lower gate. The latch did stick. It always sticks when the air is wet. I worked the oil in with a rag and tested it a few times. It moved smoother. Lucas told me a story about his neighbor's dog stealing a sock and trying to hide it in the vegetable garden. We went back to our own jobs. We didn't talk about the old man again. That was the first day. The second day, Lucas wasn't with me. He had a dentist appointment and wasn't coming in until afternoon. I signed the log at 7, nodded to Herr Köhler as he went off to fetch a box of tile he'd left in his van, and headed up the path with the rake and the bag cart. The air was clear, the kind of morning you get only a few times in autumn where you can smell wood smoke miles away. I could hear cowbells from a farm across the valley. A bus down on the main road sighed like it was tired of being a bus. I was alone on the top terrace again when the jingling started. It wasn't louder. It wasn't closer. It was exactly as it had been, a polite sound with purpose behind it. I looked up and he was there, standing next to a headstone I know too well because I'd reset it after frost heave in March. He wore the same jacket, the same cap. He looked at me like he'd gone to sleep and woken up where he'd left off. "Your supervisor," he said, and his head tilted toward the path. "He tracks. He knows the work," I nodded. "He does. The priest before this one," he said, "did not. He told me once we didn't need to check the locks on Sunday. He said God would watch them." He rolled the keys in his hands. I told him God has other things to do. I laughed before I could stop myself. He smiled in that small way again, more with the lines around his eyes than with his mouth. I wanted to ask him 10 questions, but I felt that if I made it into a challenge, he would vanish like a bird you try to corner. So I asked one. "Do you still do your rounds?" "1:30 and 1:45?" He nodded. "I start at the lower gate," he said, and he lifted one of the long keys. "This one is for the padlock we used to have there. The lock has a tongue. It sticks when it's warm." He weighed the key in his hand like a stone. "It's wrong to put a tongue in a lock that's exposed to sun," he added almost to himself. I said, "We replaced that lock in spring." The tongue rusted. He looked at me with an expression that was not surprise and not approval. "Everything rusts," he said. "You keep it moving so it remembers what it's for." Behind us on the lower path, I could hear footsteps. I turned to see a couple in hiking jackets trying to read a map. The woman pointed at the chapel like it was an answer. By the time I turned back, the old man had moved 3 steps and was circling the headstone with the slow care of someone tidying a room he loved. He kept his keys close. When he walked, they made that sound. It wasn't bothersome. It was as natural to him as breathing. I asked, "What happened in 54?" I couldn't not. The question sat there like a weight. He stopped. For the first time, he looked directly at me. His eyes were dark, not the pale you expect when you think of old photos. He held my gaze the way you'd hold a candle to check if it flickers. Winter, he said. Snow where you don't want it. We had a lantern that blew out when you breathed in. There was a drift at the west wall. I took a shovel to it. I was not as careful as I should have been. He touched his jacket buttons like counting them. I went to sleep with my boots on, he added. And something in his face changed, softened maybe. I woke up and the snow had continued without me. I didn't know what to say. It seemed wrong to say sorry. He didn't look unwell or miserable. He looked like a man at work talking about an old mistake. Before I could find a word, footsteps came on the stone again. I turned toward them out of habit. The couple were closer now. The man asking me in the slow German people use when they don't know if you're local. Where's the war memorial? I pointed, told them to take the steps and then the right path. He said thanks. I watched them go. When I turned back, the old man was gone. That's the part that makes me sound like a liar. People say, maybe he ducked behind a stone, and I nod because maybe he did. I looked, I walked between the graves. I stepped into the trees. There was nobody there. The needles on the ground didn't show a footprint because they never do. I went to the shed again and took out the spare keys and touched them like somehow they'd answer back. The metal was just metal. It felt like a thermostat that will not quite click. That day I told Lucas and he told me I was leaning into the place too hard. It can get in your head, he said. Like when you live by the train and you think you hear it even when it doesn't run. He said we should have a beer after work and I said yes. We sat by the river and he talked about his dentist. I started to say he said God has other things to do and stopped because the words sounded fragile when I paid attention to them. The third day it rained. Cold rain that looks like it's almost snow but refuses to commit. We worked in rain gear. The plastic hoods make a crinkly sound that keeps you inside your own head. The old man didn't come, no keys. Just the tap of drops in the empty watering cans and the drip off the chapel eaves. The candles in the little glass cups looked nervous. At 4 we locked up. I checked the west gate twice because I'd made myself start doing that. Not out of fear, but out of something that felt like respect. 2 days later, the priest asked me to dig. A man named Steiner had died suddenly at 70, and the family needed the plot prepared by Saturday. Saxon stones, clay underneath, not difficult but stubborn. Lucas helped me for the first hour. Then he went to fix a gutter. I worked in the usual way. Mark the corners with string, cut the turf cleanly, roll it back like a carpet, get the spade in and pull the soil onto the tarp. When the clods land on the tarp, they make a soft thud that I can still hear when I can't sleep. It's not a violent sound. It's work. Halfway down, I found a shard of old brown glass, the thick kind from beer bottles. I put it on the wall to throw away later. It was warm for November. My shirt stuck to my back. I stopped and took a drink from the bottle I'd left in the shade of the yew. That's when I heard the keys. They came from behind me, not loud like someone was careful not to startle me. I turned. He stood at the edge of the tarp with the same tidy stance. Make the walls straight, he said. It shows respect. I do, I said, a little more sharply than I meant because it sounded like criticism. He nodded. You do, he said, and if a nod can be reassured, his was. Check the bottom for water, he added. The ground by the linden holds it. I know, I said. We line with gravel if we have to. We used sand, he said, and then, almost as if talking to himself again, gravel rattles. I looked at his keys. There were at least 15 on the ring. Some were black with age. One had teeth like a saw. I tried to imagine what each opened. The chapel door is a new key now. The shed has a standard padlock. The gates are modern. I said before I could stop myself, "What do you still lock?" He seemed to consider that for a long time. His face didn't change, but the way he held himself did. Like a slight easing, like the tiniest of exhales. Things that want to wander, he said. Not evil things, he added quickly, as if he'd had to say that many times before. Just things that need to remember their place, the wind, the sound of the road, names. He lifted the keys a fraction. They all want to go. It doesn't help anyone when they do. I must have looked lost because he added gentler, "You keep a routine. That's all. You put your hand where it knows what to do. That's all." He nodded at the grave again. "Straight walls," he said like a benediction and turned away. I didn't follow. I kept working. Dirt is honest. Your body knows when the shovel is right. It was maybe 20 minutes later when Lucas called my name from the path. I looked up. He pointed at the chapel. 2 policemen were talking to Herr Köhler. They weren't excited, just doing their job. I climbed out and brushed my knees and went down. A man from the town had reported hearing voices up here the night before, they said. A woman laughing and a man answering her by the far wall. They were probably kids, the younger officer said. They liked to dare each other. Could we keep an eye out? Might we call if we saw anything? Herr Köhler said yes, we would. He said the old lantern above the west path flickered and needed a new bulb, which it did. And the police made a note as if that too might cause voices. They left in the slow way police leave when nothing is wrong but something could be. We watched them go. Lucas looked at me, one eyebrow up. Not ghosts, he said. Kids. Probably, I said, but in my head I heard the word names and it lodged there like a stone in a shoe. That evening, after we locked the gates, I did something I don't usually do. I went back up, not far, just to the first terrace to look out. The town below had its lights on. The snow that had stuck to the high peaks earlier that day held a blue light that didn't belong to anything else. I listened. I heard a bus, a car. A dog barked, the low, tired bark of habit. The wind moved through the yews and made a whispering sound I'd heard 1,000 times, and underneath it for just a second, a jingle, not demanding, not even asking to be noticed. Just present, I said out loud, because I have learned it's better not to leave a question hanging. I'll check the west gate first tomorrow. I heard nothing in reply. I went home. I dreamed about snow that night, the old fine-grained kind that builds a cornice along a roof and shatters when you touch it. In the dream, I was on the west path and the drift was higher than my head, and I kept putting my shovel in and the snow slid back as if it was a wall that healed. I woke up with the taste of cold air in my throat and the certainty that I'd left something unlocked. I checked my apartment door twice and the balcony door once. It didn't help. The next morning I was early. The sky was that color it only is before the sun gets over the ridge, pale like a face seen through a thin curtain. Frost on the grass made everything stiff. My breath made small puffs. I walked straight to the west gate. The lock was on. I did the thing that you do when you don't trust your eyes. I put my hand on it. It was cold, metal through gloves, cold but solid. I felt a stupid wave of relief. I turned and started back up the path. That's when I noticed the lantern. It's an old electric lantern mounted on a post. The bulb is one of those warm ones the parish buys because they look more forgiving. It was on but barely. Not flickering like a bad connection, but dim like it was at the tail end of a long inhale. It shouldn't have been on at all at that hour. The sensor turns it off at dawn. I put my hand over the sensor to trick it and then removed it. Nothing changed. The light held steady, weak as a remembered song. I looked around because of course you do when something is not doing what it should. I saw nobody. I put my gloved hand on the post and felt, this is the part that makes me feel foolish, like the smallest vibration. Not like an electrical hum, more like the tremor of something holding still on purpose. I stepped back. I felt suddenly as if I had walked into a room where someone was praying. Not because there was God in it, because there was a concentration that didn't include me. I whispered because it felt right, all good. I'll come back at dusk. The light did not change, but I had the oddest sense that if it could nod, it would. I worked that day with a care that made Lucas tease me. He said I was acting like the bishop was coming to inspect. I shrugged. It wasn't that. It felt like being watched not with suspicion, but with expectation. People say that about the dead sometimes, that they look on. I've never been sure. The living have quick eyes for the living. The dead are busy with their own gravity. But if routine is a kind of faith, then I had it. We had 3 funerals over the next week. In November here, that's normal. Darkness makes people hurry to lay things down. I dug and filled, I swept. I fixed the lantern finally with a new bulb, and I oiled the west gate for my own peace. The old man came twice more. He never asked for anything. He never complained. He said small things like, sweep toward the inside so the dust doesn't go over the wall, and put the watering cans back upside down so the handles don't hold water. Lucas saw him once, but only at a distance. He waved. The old man didn't wave back. Lucas asked who that was. I said Einar before I decided not to say anything, and Lucas laughed and called me a storyteller and put it down to me being bored. 1 afternoon, when the sun is already thinking about leaving at 3, I looked up. The I was stacking votive candle boxes near the chapel door when I heard the keys close by. I looked up and he was standing by the memorial with the names of the townspeople lost in the war. The letters were gilded last year. They glow a little even when the sun doesn't touch them. He had his hat in his hand. His hair was flat and gray, combed to one side. He was not wearing gloves. His fingers were narrow and blue at the knuckles, like someone who lives with cold. He looked at the names for a long time. I asked permission to ring the bell for them. He said quietly, and I had to take a step toward him to hear. They told me no. It wasn't the custom. We were not a place for those kinds of ceremonies. I rang it anyway once when nobody was watching. I thought it would break and then I would have to replace it and explain myself by working. It didn't break. He put his hat back on. Things like bells are made to forgive small disobediences. I don't think anyone would have minded, I said. He smiled without joy. They minded everything. Then they minded nothing. Then they minded again. He looked at me. Do you mind? I didn't know what he meant, but I shook my head. I try not to, I said, and it felt like the truest thing I'd said that week. That was the last time he spoke more than a sentence. A cold front came in, the kind that steals even the birdsong and makes every sound land hard. The snow that had been thinking about us finally made up its mind. The world went white and tight. We learned which branches would complain first when the wind sat on them. I started wearing an extra sweater. We closed the taps and wrapped the pipes with rags. Routine grew thick. If you broke it, you felt like you'd knocked over a glass at someone else's table. The day it happened, Lucas was homesick. He texted me at 6 to say he had a fever and a cough. He'd tested negative and was going to sleep. I told him to actually sleep and not watch videos with the sound off like he usually did. I walked up to the cemetery under a sky that couldn't decide which gray to be. The snow from the night before squeaked under my boots. No one else was around. The chapel roof held a clean white line that made everything look new. I unlocked the shed and did the thing I do without thinking. Glance at the hook where our spare keys hang. 2 hooks, 2 sets. The Westgate pair and the lower. Both were in place. I signed the logbook. I set my gloves on the bench. Then I heard the jingle outside the door. Light, expectant. I opened it and he was standing there like he'd been waiting for me to finish my thought. Dusk, he said like a greeting. Lanterns at dusk. It's morning, I said, and then because it felt like answering an old friend in a code you used long ago, I added, rounds at past. He nodded once. I stepped out and closed the shed behind me. He turned and walked toward the upper path with that careful walk that had started to feel like part of the terrain to me, like the way the path always dips a little by the larch. I followed, not because I had something to ask, but because I knew if I didn't, now I would find an excuse later. We walked side by side without touching, our boots making the slow, regular noise of work. At the top, he paused by the gap in the hedge and looked out over the town. Smoke rose from a chimney somewhere in a straight line that only happens when the air holds itself by the shoulders. I could hear the morning bus downshifting on the main road. He lifted his keys on their ring and they caught a weak light. For the first time I thought I saw frost along the edges of the iron. They forget, he said. Who? I asked. Everyone, he said, and I didn't know if he meant the living or the dead, especially when it snows. We stood like that for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable. We listened to the town start its day. Then the wind moved just enough to make the ewes whisper. He closed his hand over the ring of keys as if to hush them. He nodded toward the west path. You'll lock it early, he said, like it was a question and not. There will be children. It's a school day, I said. They should be in class. Should, he said, and nothing in his voice made it a scold, but I felt like I'd missed something obvious. He started down the path. I followed. He went past the rows of stones in the low wall and stood by the gate like a boulder in a stream. I could see footprints in the fresh snow that weren't ours. Small, 2 sets pointing inward. They went to the wall and stopped. There was a place where the snow was pushed down as if someone had handed their friend a hand up. My stomach did that slow twist it does when you realize a problem isn't theoretical. I'll call the police, I said. Call, he said, but he didn't move. He took one of the keys and held it up to the lock like a priest holds a wafer. He didn't put it in. He just held it there until I, without really deciding to, put my hand on the gate and felt the cold through my glove and the slight give as I tested the latch. It was closed. I took my hand away, I called. The operator sounded as she always does. Calm, efficient, a little bored by everything that was not urgent. She said a car would come by. While I waited, the old man and I stood without speaking. I tried to picture two kids climbing the wall. I tried to picture what they'd come for in a place that holds nothing you can use or sell. The police came with their measured walk and their soft voices. They took photos of the footprints. They went along the path and looked behind the trees and up to the top terraces. They found nothing. They said it was likely two kids before school who wanted to say they'd done something brave. They said they'd inform the schools. They said we should call if we saw anything again. They left. The old man hadn't moved except to tilt his head politely when one of the officers nodded to him on the way out. When they were gone, he said, "You will lock it now." "It's not even noon," I said. "We can't while it's open hours." It came out more annoyed than I meant. He didn't react. He lifted the keys again. They didn't jingle this time. They made a heavier sound, like two keys had leaned hard against each other. He took a step back from the gate and looked at me, and the look was not command. It was trust, and also the weight that comes with trust. I reached for the lock and stopped because I could see, just past the edge of the wall, something bright caught in the snow. I stepped off the path and bent and picked it up. It was a plastic hair clip, the cheap kind with little teeth, the top molded into a butterfly painted pink. One of the wings was broken. I held it in my hand and felt a kind of sorrow that didn't belong to me and yet somehow did. "I'll check the paths," I said. "All of them." My voice sounded like someone else's. He nodded, and if I say his eyes looked kind, I don't mean in the way of a grandfather at a kitchen table. I mean like a man relieved that a bridge has held under a winter load. Then he turned and started up the path, not fast but not slow enough that I could keep easy time with him. I went the other way. I walked every terrace. I looked behind the benches and the big stones and the low wall near the memorial. I didn't find anything more. I put the hair clip on the ledge inside the shed, next to the old brown glass I hadn't thrown away yet. And for a moment I had an urge to put the two objects together, as if they might understand each other. I didn't. At dusk I lit the chapel candles. I say lit, but you turn a little switch under the plastic and the LEDs glow like a memory of fire. People like them, they don't blow out in drafts. They don't drip. They look like faith even when it's too tired to be bright. I walked to the west path and stood under the lantern I'd fixed and watched it come on. It did slowly, like someone waking up in a warm room. The snow made everything more obvious. The footprints from that morning were softened, not gone. New ones hadn't come. I locked the gates in the order I never used to bother with and now did without thinking, lower than west. When I came back up the path, I saw him standing by the linden tree where Lucas and I sometimes eat our bread. He didn't move when I approached. I stood next to him, and for a second the world lined up so that the chapel door, the mountains, and his cap felt like parts of a clock face. He said, "You put the watering cans away upside down," in a tone that was almost teasing, and for the first time I laughed without feeling the laugh catch in my throat. "I did," I said. "We didn't say anything else." The sky went from gray to that strange violet that winter evenings make. The town turned on its lights. Somewhere down there, someone opened a window and let music out. Faint, warm, domestic. He shifted the keys in his hand, and the sound they made was almost too small to hear. We walked toward the shed together. At the door, he stopped. He looked at the plaque for a long time. The way people look at photographs of themselves from a life they both recognize and don't. He reached out and touched the rusted corner lightly with the back of a knuckle, as if so as not to stain himself. He didn't sigh. He didn't do anything theatrical. He just stood in the small, neat posture he had always had, and looked at his name where it had been for 70 years. "I will do the rounds," he said, and if it was to me or the door or the thin cold air I couldn't tell. I nodded. "1:30, I said. "1:45. He didn't answer. When I looked up from the lock, he was gone. Since then, it's been ordinary again. Or it has in the way that the ordinary is a place you maintain as carefully as a gate. Lucas came back after his fever. He learned I'd started checking the west gate first and called me superstitious and then started doing it too. Because that's how habits spread between friends. The police didn't come again. We didn't find any more footprints in the snow where there should be none. The hair clip sat on the shed ledge for a week, and then someone, maybe Lucas, maybe me, put it in the drawer where we keep the string and the spare candles and the pens that only write in blue. The old man hasn't come lately. Or he has, and I haven't been the one looking at the right moment. I keep my routine with a care that sometimes makes my hands ache. I put my palm on the locks even when I can see they're thrown. I straighten the watering cans without needing to. I say good morning to the names I walk past. The ones I know because their families come on Thursdays, and I tell them the weather like a fool. When wind pushes at the gate, I hear the keys in my head. When kids from the school cut through the lower path at lunch and pretend not to look at the headstones, I feel the urge to scold them soften in my mouth. I say Grüß Gott like an old man, and it works better than hey. The lantern by the west path burns steady now. On evenings when the snow is itchy in the air and the light goes too fast, I stand under it and listen. The town does what towns do. The mountains hold their breath. Somewhere in the hedge a bird considers, changes its mind, and tucks its head under a wing. Every so often when I close the shed, I hear a jingle that is not my keys and not Lucas's, and not anything that belongs to the parish. It's quiet, the sound of work being done without an audience. It feels like a promise held up to the light to make sure it hasn't frayed at the edges. I don't turn around quickly when I hear it. I don't scan the trees. I don't call out. I say in a normal voice, like the way you say you'll be home before dark to someone who will not sleep until you are. I'll check the west gate first, and I go down the path in the order I've learned. If you come up here on a weekday and see a man in a dark jacket standing by the linden tree, watching the paths as if they were a puzzle he's solved 1,000 times and is always happy to solve again, don't make a story about it while you're still in the gate. Lock your bike properly. Keep your voice low. If you see me, and you ask if I've ever met the original groundskeeper, I'll say something ordinary like only on the plaque. I'll point you to the chapel because that's what you came for. And when you go, and your footsteps make that neat crunch on the gravel I've just raked, I will wait for the tiny respectful sound of keys reminding the evening where it belongs. And I'll pretend it's the wind tugging at the padlock so that later, if you ask me again, I can say all the practical things that make people nod and go home, but I won't change my routine. I can't. Some locks don't forgive a second try. Some names want to wander. And sometimes on winter nights when the lantern hums a little against the snow, and I can see my breath only if I look for it, I think I see frost along the edge of a long iron key, and a hand closing over it with a patience I haven't earned yet. And I carry on, because that's what keeps a place like this from becoming just another field by the road.